In the early hours of the 26th of June 2022, 29-year-old career criminal Jordan McSweeney was drunk and lurking around the streets of Ilford, a town in East London in the UK, looking for a woman to rape. He'd already been kicked out of a pub for groping a woman and was combing the streets looking for a victim. He'd already followed at least 4 women who'd managed to escape when he spotted 35-year-old aspiring solicitor Zara Aleena, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, who was walking the short distance home from a night out. McSweeney followed Zara, then attacked her, dragging her into the driveway of a house where he subjected her to a horrific attack. He sexually assaulted her, strangled her, and savagely beat her, including kicking and stamping on her head. He then left Zara to die in the street. She was found by a member of the public, still alive, but the 46 separate horrific injuries she suffered had caused catastrophic trauma to her body, and Zara soon lost her fight for life. This case caught the national attention. A young woman viciously attacked by a complete stranger. It hit at the very heart of our fear that we or a loved one could go out one day and then never come home. Horror turned to anger when it was revealed that Jordan McSweeney had a long criminal history and had only been out of prison for 9 days when he killed Zara. And on the day he committed this crime, he should have been back behind bars. However, staggering failings by the probation service meant that he was free to kill. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Jordan McSweeney was born in 1993 in Dagenham in East London, but when he was still an infant, his family moved to Borstal, a suburb of the town of Rochester in Kent, which is in the southeast of England. McSweeney had an extremely turbulent upbringing. His mother was a drug addict who was more interested in getting her next fix than raising her children. In court, it was stated that McSweeney had called his mother a, quote, very spiteful, vindictive, and horribly poisonous person. McSweeney's father was barely in his life, and when he was a violent bully who subjected McSweeney's mother to horrific acts of domestic abuse, including beating her savagely and trying to drown her in the bath, all whilst their small son watched. Neighbours who knew the family later confirmed the domestic situation and that McSweeney was a chronically neglected child. As years progressed, his mother would have a succession of partners, all violent, who would beat her up but also victimise McSweeney. Like many children from a similar background, McSweeney saw comfort the only place he could, on the streets, and he soon fell in with other neglected children whose parents were either entirely absent from their lives or simply didn't care where they were or what they were doing. Before he turned 10 years old, McSweeney was going around the local area, causing a nuisance to the community. One neighbour later stated, quote, Jordan was bad. Another said that he was, quote, a little shit. McSweeney did go to school, but he was almost always truant and was known as a violent thug, which quickly led to him being expelled. However, McSweeney was not interested in education. He was interested in 2 things: money and making a reputation for himself. By his mid-teens, McSweeney was selling drugs and also participating in bare-knuckle boxing fights for money. He would also go around battering anyone and everyone he perceived as weaker than him. He would take great pleasure in catching the eye of someone he knew he could easily dominate physically and saying things like, "What are you looking at?" He was a bully and a coward. In 2005, aged 12, his criminal record began when he received a reprimand from the police for 2 counts of assault related to him fighting in the street. However, this was just a fraction of the offences he was committing and the antisocial behaviour he was involved in. McSweeney and his friends would ride around the pavements on motorcycles, deliberately driving close to elderly people to scare them, and zooming past people with dogs to scare the animals. The group were also going around stealing anything that wasn't nailed down and smashing up people's property. They would soon escalate to breaking into people's shops and eventually their homes. Individually, Jordan McSweeney was described as a polite, baby-faced teenager, but he would smile sweetly to someone that he'd known all of his life, but then be hurling abuse to them later when he was with his friends or breaking into their homes for a quick payday. He would brag to people about double-crossing and backstabbing friends and family. If it would benefit him, McSweeney would do it. He had no loyalty to anyone. McSweeney's behaviour went unchecked. He'd never been taught boundaries or the value of other people or their property. If anyone dared to call the police, then he and his group of thugs would target and victimise these people, One person who knew McSweeney later recalled calling the police about his antisocial behaviour and a car then being targeted and the windows smashed. Quickly, the local community found that McSweeney was someone not to cross. His behaviour was unpredictable due to the fact that McSweeney, from around the age of 14 years old, would spend most days drinking vast quantities of alcohol and taking drugs, including snorting line after line of cocaine. In 2006 and 2009, McSweeney ended up before the court of burglaries and thefts. The latter of these convictions resulted in his first spell in prison. In 2010, so when he was 17, McSweeney badly assaulted a teenage girl who'd rejected him. He responded by slapping her in the face, giving her a swollen eye. This conviction, on paper, is the first indicator of the most relevant part of this case, McSweeney's risk to women. But this was something that had been obvious for a number of years, but had not resulted in conviction. Specifically, after his conviction for murder in 2022, a woman called Samantha Bryan came forward, who said that she'd been in a relationship with Jordan McSweeney for around 4 years, from around 2007 to 2011, and she described horrific abuse, with there being disturbing parallels between McSweeney's treatment of her and the murder of Zara Aleena years later. In particular, she reported repeated savage violence at the hands of Jordan McSweeney, where he would get her on the ground and proceed to kick her in the head and stamp on her face. She also described an incident where he kicked the door off its hinges to get to her and then began chasing her around a room. In addition to this, he would bite and pinch her, acts which were deliberately employed to cause her the maximum amount of pain. After these incidents, he would then apologise, blaming his abuse on the fact that he had had a bad childhood. His abuse was not just physical, it was also mental. McSweeney would humiliate Samantha in front of her friends and family. She eventually separated from McSweeney permanently in 2011 when he was around 18 years old, but only after one last horrifying incident. Specifically, McSweeney knocked Samantha to the floor, began stamping on her head. She was able to call the police and was taken to hospital, where she was told by doctors that she was lucky she hadn't lost her sight. Samantha was too scared to press charges. After this, her mother worked to cut off any avenue of communication with McSweeney, and Samantha, luckily, never saw him again. However, although 11 years had passed by the time she spoke to the press, Samantha said the trauma she suffered from McSweeney was still with her, and she recalled almost prophetically, quote, "My mum always said, from when I was in a relationship with him, he's going to end up killing someone." Breaking here, it's necessary to highlight who Jordan McSweeney was at this point and why. He was a deeply damaged man whose childhood had been dominated by violence. Initially, this involved him being a small child, witnessing and being subjected to this behaviour, but he soon learned that this was the way to behave, the way to get respect, treat others that annoyed him, target those weaker than him, and even make money. In his mind, there was no problem that couldn't be solved with violence. Running alongside this was a hatred of women. This inevitably stemmed from his mother. It's clear that McSweeney despised his mother, likely for choosing drugs over him and not protecting him from the abuse of her various partners. Jordan McSweeney's upbringing had also given him no concept of boundaries. He felt entitled to do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. If he wanted money, he would rob and steal, and if anyone tried to stop him, he would beat them up or smash up their property. Whilst this was his mentality generally, due to his hatred of women, the most savage and sadistic violence was reserved for them. If any woman did not give him what he wanted, then he would subject them to horrific acts of violence. By his late teens/early adulthood, he'd already demonstrated he was willing to act in a manner that could easily cause them to lose their sight or even their lives by kicking and stamping on their heads. Given his serious risk to women, even at a young age, it is, in some respects, surprising McSweeney didn't kill anyone earlier in his life. But this was primarily because he was a career criminal who spent most of his adult life behind bars. Between 2009 and 2019, so between the ages of 16 and 26, Jordan McSweeney was sent to prison 6 times, almost entirely related to burglary. There was a repeating pattern. McSweeney would go to prison, come out, and within months, weeks, or even days, go straight back to a life of crime, violating the security of people's homes to make money for himself, which would then be used to fund his alcohol and drug binges. And this is how McSweeney saw society and the people in it, merely as opportunities, When he came out, this was his green light to cause as much chaos as possible, to get as high and as drunk as possible, until he was sent back inside, where he could get 3 meals a day and a roof over his head until the next time he was released. And round he went. Prison meant nothing to Jordan McSweeney. Rules meant nothing to him. Other people meant nothing to him. McSweeney's world was solely about him, getting what he wanted and punishing those who stood in his way. On the 28th of September 2020, Jordan McSweeney was again released from prison on licence, and the same pattern emerged, with him quickly going back to his old ways. It's allegedly almost immediately robbed and beat up a female friend of his mother's. However, there wasn't enough evidence to convict him of this. Instead, he was sent back to prison just 4 months later, due to his behaviour during a previous spell inside. This included him racially abusing prison staff, making improvised weapons, and smashing up his cell. And so, back he went to prison, where he would remain until his next release on the 17th of June 2022, just 9 days before he murdered Zara Aleena. A woman, in complete contrast to him, was caring, loving, selfless, and who wanted to contribute to this world and not simply take. Zara Natasha Aleena was born in 1986 into a close-knit Pakistani family. Unfortunately, Zara's father left when she was young, but the family stepped up, and everyone, aunts, uncles, grandparents and cousins, all raised her. The family didn't have much money, but they wanted the best for Zara, and so what they did have, they'd put into her education, with then giving her the tools to go far in the world. But the drive to get there came from her. Zara devoured knowledge. She did well into school and would spend time going around the capital, going to galleries and museums, wanted to expand her mind. From a young age, she wanted to be a solicitor, in particular, once specialising in immigration law, so she could protect the rights of others. However, Zara had to balance her studies with her responsibilities, which she took very seriously. Both her mother and grandmother had significant health issues, and she was their carer. She would walk between their homes on Cranbrook Road, at the town of Ilford in East London, several times a day to look after them. She had a bedroom in each house, so she could stay overnight if she needed to, and it was to one of these properties she was walking on the night of her murder. Her family came first, so it wasn't until her 30s that Zara could pursue her dream. She obtained a place to study law at the University of Westminster and worked hard to get her degree. Just 5 weeks before her murder, Zara obtained a job in admin at the Royal Courts of Justice. On her first day, she was ecstatic and sent an excited, smiling selfie to her family and friends. She had her foot in the door, and she was confident she would soon work her way up to being a fully qualified solicitor, the career she had been dreaming of since she was a child. Zara was a beautiful, intelligent, motivated and strong woman who cared fiercely for her family and the right of others, and she was within touching distance of her goals. Her future was cruelly snatched away from her by one pathetic coward. Zara was also a popular woman. After her death, a friend of hers shared a heartbreaking text message exchange sent just 48 hours before her murder, where the pair had planned to meet up the next weekend. On the evening of Saturday the 25th of June 2022, Zara Aleena left her home in Cranbrook Road in Ilford and walked the short distance to the town centre to meet a friend for a night out. They first went to a local pub called the Great Spoon of Ilford, where they had some drinks and dinner before walking a short distance to a local bar, where they stayed until around 2 a.m. on Sunday the 26th of June. Zara's friend said goodbye to her and got a taxi. Zara walked everywhere, and today was no different. She decided to walk home. It was a warm evening. This was a walk she'd done a million times before, and it would only take her 30 minutes. So she began on her way. Unfortunately, she could not have known that a dangerous predator was stalking the streets, looking for a woman to attack, and their paths would soon tragically cross. As I've already stated, on the evening of Saturday the 25th of June 2022, into the early hours of Sunday the 26th of June, Zara Aleena was in Ilford town centre, spending time with a friend. During the same time period, Jordan McSweeney was also lurking the streets of the town. He'd been released from custody just 9 days before and was wanted for recall back to prison. But, as I'll get into later, management of his case by the probation service was appalling. They didn't know his location, and he'd been given chance after chance to comply. But despite this, he'd been allowed to remain at liberty. His return to prison should have been initiated on the day of his release, but it wasn't. He'd spent the day since his release in a drunken, drug-induced stupor in London before contacting a friend of his who was working as a travelling fun fair in Valentine's Park in Ilford. This man was staying in a caravan and offered McSweeney a place to stay, which he accepted. On the evening of the 25th of June 2022, Jordan McSweeney went from this caravan into Ilford town centre and began drinking heavily. He went into the same pub that Zara had been in, the Great Spoon of Ilford, but she'd moved on by the time he arrived. McSweeney began to sexually harass women, trying to kiss them and rubbing himself against them. He groped the breasts of one woman and tried to sexually assault a barmaid. Security got involved, and he was kicked out at around 11 p.m. As with much of his behaviour that night, Jordan McSweeney staggering away was caught on CCTV. McSweeney then spent the next 3 hours staggering around the streets, both on Cranbrook Road, the site of the eventual attack, but also streets coming off of this. He was looking for a woman to sexually assault. McSweeney proceeds to follow at least 4 women before he attacked Zara. He followed this woman, who went to a shop to try to escape. McSweeney then entered, stood for a while, and left. The woman had hidden herself behind some shelves. She waited a few minutes and then emerged, but McSweeney had also hidden himself, out of the way, waiting for her to come out. She began walking and saw McSweeney striding towards her. She then ran for her life, with McSweeney chasing her, but she was able to outrun him. He then began to follow another woman, shown by the blue arrow. She noticed she was being followed and crossed the road, but he kept pace. She was eventually able to dart inside her house and lock the door. McSweeney then staggered outside a local chicken shop, where a woman was inside. He stood outside, staring at her through the window, and had his hands in his trousers appearing to masturbate. He waited outside the shop until she left and began following her, but only for a short distance, until his attention fell on another woman standing outside a community centre. It's not known whether McSweeney knew this woman, as she's never been traced, but he went over to her, spoke to her, and pushed his hands between her legs before she pushed him off. They then walked for a short distance before he got bored and walked off. The last woman that McSweeney followed before attacking Zara was walking home, where she realised there was a man behind her keeping pace. She sped up, and he did the same. He followed her into Northbrook Road, a short distance away from Cranbrook Road. McSweeney then overtook her and was seen on CCTV stooping down in a driveway slightly up the road, waiting for her to come past, inevitably so he could attack her. However, luckily for this woman, she lived in a property before this point, on the opposite side of the road, and had reached safety and slammed the door behind her. This was just around 2 a.m, and McSweeney then walked back towards Cranbrook Road, the same moment that Zara was walking home along the same street. It was at this junction that Jordan McSweeney first saw Zara Aleena, with her walking in this direction up the road. He then crossed over and began to follow her. Jordan McSweeney followed Zara up the road for approximately 15 minutes, and at 2:17 a.m, he attacked. McSweeney approached Zara from behind at speed, grabbing her, placing one arm around her neck, and putting his other hand over her mouth. He then dragged her from the pavement into the driveway of a house on Cranbrook Road. CCTV at this property caught part of the attack. Zara struggled and fought against McSweeney, who began punching her. He then forced her to the ground, pushed by her legs, but Zara was able to get up before being grabbed and forced back down to the ground again. McSweeney then knocked Zara unconscious, began kicking her head and stamping on her face. At some point, McSweeney also strangled Zara. When she was on the ground not moving, McSweeney removed some of Zara's clothing, including her underwear, and attempted to rape her. As if this crime wasn't horrific enough, McSweeney then got up, walked a short distance away, before returning to deliver more vicious stamps on Zara's head. He held onto a post, leaving a bloody fingerprint, in order to balance himself and enable him to put as much force as possible into every stamp and kick. He then decided to rob Zara, taking her phone and handbag, before walking away. However, he returned again for a final time and continued to stamp on Zara's head and chest. He then left the scene, and CCTV cameras captured him returning to the caravan he was staying in at the time. As a result of the attack, Zara received 46 separate horrific injuries. She had severe blunt force trauma to her head, which had caused catastrophic brain damage. She also had deep cuts to her scalp, bleeding to her lips, eyes, nose, mouth, and jaw from being stamped on and kicked. She also had injuries to her genitals. The ordeal that Zara endured lasted 9 minutes. Zara was alive when 2 passers-by found her unconscious and covered in blood in the driveway where she'd been attacked at 2:44 a.m. They called an ambulance from the police. She was taken to the Royal London Hospital, but her injuries were too extensive, and after bravely holding on, Zara Aleena passed away at 9:58 a.m. on Sunday the 26th of June 2022. She was just 35 years old. Within hours of the attack, police obtained CCTV along the entire route of Zara Aleena's journey, as well as the doorbell footage covering the area of the attack itself. This enabled them to quickly establish that she'd been followed and that the man who'd been stalking her was the one that attacked her. They also found footage of this same man following multiple other women. This grainy footage enabled inquiries to be made about potential suspects, and several names were put forward, including that of Jordan McSweeney. A bloody fingerprint was found at the scene of the attack, but it was too poor quality to be fed directly into the national database and had to be analysed by hand. This was compared to fingerprints held on suspects, which had been named during the inquiries, and it was found to match Jordan McSweeney. CCTV footage was also able to trace McSweeney back to the caravan site at Valentine's Park. It was around 3:30 p.m. on the 27th of June 2022, the day after the murder. The police descended on the area. They asked people at the site whether they knew Jordan McSweeney. They said they did. When asked where he was, they pointed to a caravan and said that he was asleep inside. The police entered and arrested him, as shown by this body cam footage.
Jordan. Jordan? Jordan. Jordan. Jordan McSweeney.
Cuffs on, yeah?
And then stand up for us, mate.
Just tell him.
You're under arrest for rape and murder of a female at Cranbrook Road, okay? On the 26th of June 2022 in the early hours of the morning. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence. If you do not mention when questioned something you later rely on in court, and if you do so, maybe given an evidence, you understand? Right, stand up for a second, mate. Stand up.
Right?
Okay.
I've got it. Yep. Come forward.
Just going to search you now, alright?
Whilst it's not shown in that piece of footage, it's reported that McSweeney yawned loudly when he was hauled off by the police and said they were boring him. When asked about blood on his clothing, Zara's blood, he claimed this was his own and was due to a dog bite. In custody, showing the fact that he was aggressive to officers and challenged them to a fight. However, when in interview, he simply sat there repeating no comment over and over again. His silence didn't matter. The police had CCTV footage and forensic evidence tying him to the crime, and Jordan McSweeney was charged with the murder of Zara Aleena and remanded into prison to await his day in court. Jordan McSweeney appeared at the Old Bailey in London on the 3rd of November 2022 and pleaded guilty to the murder of Zara Aleena. His sentence was due to take place at the same court on the 14th of December. This pathetic excuse for a man refused to attend the sentencing hearing. I completely agree that people like this should be dragged to the hearing to face their punishment. But then, on the other hand, I imagine they would kick off and be disruptive. This slightly caused the family of the victim, if they were present, even more distress. It's a no-win situation. Like the proceedings themselves, whilst McSweeney could be sent to prison forever, it wouldn't bring Zara back. So, due to his cowardice, the sentencing judge, Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb, read out her sentencing remarks as though McSweeney was present in the courtroom. This was again one of the few occasions where cameras were allowed in the court to film proceedings, so I want to play the sentence for you.
I have taken care to avoid double counting. The sexual assault is a Category 1A offence because the defendant used violence and threats and abducted the victim from the street. There was a significant degree of premeditation because he wandered around the area until he found the ideal circumstances in which to commit the offence. This was a particularly violent sexual assault committed at night in a public place on a woman out alone. The defendant removed Miss Aleena's knickers and caused injuries to her genitalia, as well as the injuries that led to her death. The sentence for that offence of sexual assault, had I been dealing with it alone, would have been 6 years imprisonment. Taking into account his history of offending, had there not been a guilty plea, I would allow 1/3 discount for the plea. I take the view that this offence is already incorporated into the minimum term for murder because I have taken the higher starting point of 30 years and I reflect the aggravating features of it in the minimum term for the murder. Having been arrested on the 27th of June, the defendant was charged with murder and rape on the 29th of June. On reception in prison, he indicated that he could not comprehend that he had done what he had done. He appeared for a preliminary hearing on the 1st of July 2022 and his PTPH was set for the 30th of September 2022. Prior to the listing, the solicitors acting for the defendant wrote to the court to inform them that they had not received an expert report commissioned from a psychiatrist because the defendant had not seen him. Furthermore, owing to the industrial action being taken by the defence bar, his instructed advocate would not be present. Accordingly, I adjourned the hearing to the 19th of October, and an extension was given for service of the defence statement. The defendant failed, without a reasonable excuse, to attend 2 appointments with the psychologist on the 21st of September and the 3rd of October. The solicitors wrote to the court again to request a further adjournment. When the case came before the court for PTPH on the 19th of October, the defendant refused to attend, and it became apparent that he had not attended a conference that had been arranged with his solicitors. The defence were directed to secure the services of a psychologist who could provide a report as soon as possible, and the PTPH was adjourned to the 24th of October. On that date, the solicitor still did not have a report, and the PTPH was adjourned once again to the 11th of November. In the report of Dr. Black, which is dated the 26th of October, and which was, I'm sure, in the hands of the defence soon after that date, the defendant suggests that he did not remember what had happened, and he could not believe what he was seeing when shown the CCTV in interview. In fact, at the police interviews after arrest, the defendant affected a bored and disinterested facade. The defendant was not produced at the next hearing because he tested positive for COVID. The PTPH was put back to the 16th of November. Despite a direction that he attend in person, the defendant refused to come to court on the 16th of November and a video link had to be arranged. The defence took instructions from the defendant and approached the prosecution about potential pleas, and this was indicated to the court. The PTPH was adjourned to the 19th of November, and on that occasion, the defendant pleaded guilty to the preferred 2-count indictment, murder and sexual assault. I accept that the defence solicitors commissioned expert reports to ensure there was no psychiatric defence to the charge of murder and to ensure fitness to plead and to be tried. These were responsible steps in a case of such gravity. I also accept that because of the action taken by criminal barristers, the defendant was not able to receive advice from junior barristers or King's Counsel until October this year. I reject the suggestion from the defence that because he was heard on a prison phone telling his mother that he was banged to rights, he should be taken to have indicated at a very early stage that he would accept responsibility for the killing. He never indicated this to the court until the 16th of November, and at stages, his non-engagement frustrated the work being done on his behalf. In addition, as Mr. Carter Stevenson accepted in his written submission on sentence, he caused some additional delay through taking a belligerent attitude when required to come to court, including telling the jailers on one occasion that there was no point in attending a hearing at which he was required. Overall, my conclusion is that the defendant is entitled to less than the maximum discount on the murder count, and I would allow 1/8. Although given the length of the term I will impose, the maximum discount allowed can be 5 years. Considering all these features, after a trial the minimum term would have been 43 years. I allow 5 years, as I have said, for the plea of guilty indicated by counsel on the 16th of November, a few weeks before trial. The sentence of 4 years concurrent is imposed for sexual assault. The sentence for the brutal, sexually motivated murder of Zara Aleena is imprisonment for life. The defendant will serve 38 years as the minimum term. The court would like to thank counsel and also to commend Mr. and Mrs. Condor, Georgina Woolard and Maria Bergam.
So, to clarify, for the murder of Zara Aleena, Jordan McSweeney was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 38 years to serve before he can apply for parole. It would be naive of me to say that no one who pleads guilty to murder does so because they genuinely feel sorry for what they've done and are willing to accept their punishment. However, this couldn't be further from the truth in the case of McSweeney. Clearly he knew he'd be convicted and pleaded guilty in order to get a reduced sentence. His lack of remorse is shown firstly by him refusing to attend his sentencing hearing, but also the fact that he appealed his length of sentence. This hearing took place at the Court of Appeal in October 2023. I've read the court ruling, and it's a really upsetting document. So McSweeney, through his barrister, produced a number of points which he claimed the judge interpreted incorrectly when reaching her sentence. This included him claiming his actions were not premeditated. However, the appeal court obviously rejected that, considering he was following multiple women on the night of the murder. However, one of the points raised was that the judge made an error in determining that he caused Zara Aleena gratuitous mental or physical torment during this attack. The argument was that whilst his behaviour was extremely violent and the attack lasted 9 minutes, Zara was likely unconscious within 30 seconds of the start of the assault, and so would have not been aware of what was going on after this point. In essence, she couldn't have felt fear or pain during the majority of the attack because she was unconscious. The Court of Appeal agreed with this point, which I find disgusting. 30 seconds, in the grand scheme of things, is absolutely nothing, but if you're being attacked and fighting for your life, imagine it feels like an eternity. And during those last few seconds, where she was aware, I imagine Zara felt absolutely terrified and had so many thoughts running through her head. Fear she would be raped, fear she would be killed, fear that she would never see her family again. I'm sorry, but I think the appeal court got this wrong. I don't believe that any appeal should have been considered, arguing this crime was less heinous or minimising Zara's suffering. However, regardless of my own thoughts, the Court of Appeal reduced Jordan McSweeney's sentence from a minimum of 38 years to a minimum of 33 years. Making this situation even more sickening is the fact that Jordan McSweeney could not even be bothered to stay for the whole of the appeal hearing and left halfway through. So essentially, he failed to attend 2 court hearings. Potentially that's the answer. If you don't bother to show up to your sentencing hearing, you cannot complain about it afterwards. If you don't bother to stay for your appeal, then we'll throw it out. Essentially, you don't turn up, well fuck you then. I'm sure someone with a legal background will provide a compelling explanation as to why this would be inappropriate, and I fully understand that. But from a human and emotional perspective, I do think that people like Jordan McSweeney are given far more consideration and humanity than they deserve. Despite the reduction in his sentence, Jordan McSweeney will not be eligible for parole until 2055, by which point he'll be in his 60s. Hopefully, he is never released. Jordan McSweeney had been released from prison only 9 days before he murdered Zara Aleena, and it's necessary at this point to highlight the failings in this case, which left an extremely dangerous man free to roam the streets to commit this horrific crime. As Jordan McSweeney was on licence under probation supervision at the time of the murder, a serious review was conducted to determine what mistakes, if any, made by professionals may have contributed to the death of Zara Aleena. The final report is a terrible look into the failings of the probation service, who are tasked to manage people like Jordan McSweeney when they're released from prison. A few things need to be explained in order to understand this case. Firstly, most prisoners who receive a custodial sentence in the court are automatically released at the halfway point of their sentence. This is not the case for life sentences, for example for murder, where their release is only directed by the parole board. However, in almost all other cases, people serve half their sentence in prison and half in the community. In the community, they're subject to a license, which is a physical document with certain conditions on it. There are standard conditions, such as only residing in an address, approved by the probation officer, and attending all appointments, but the number and types of additional conditions are determined by the officer dealing with the case. Depending on the level of risk a person is assessed to pose, the type of offence they've committed, and their risk factors, there could be few or many additional conditions, which could range from drug and alcohol testing to staying away from certain people or places. It's basically a list of rules, highlighting to the offender that being in the community is a privilege, and there are conditions attached to this. If the offender breaks the rules, they go back to prison, although they're usually given chances to correct their behaviour before this final step is taken. However, the mechanism should be that if an offender is displaying offence-paralleling behaviour, which indicates they're likely to commit a serious offence, they should be recalled immediately. If forming how many chances an offender gets, the list of conditions they're subject to, and how they're generally managed are risk assessments completed by the probation officers. These should be based on thorough information gathering, not just documents from court, but essentially any scrap of information, for example police intelligence, which should be obtained to identify who the offender is, what their risk factors are, what their warning signs are, what they're likely to do when they come out of prison, and, if they were to commit another offence, what would this likely be, and what would be the resulting harm to others. Even from the information I've presented in this video, I think you and yourself could see that Jordan McSweeney fits within the category known as high risk of serious harm, which is an indicator that, when he's in the community, he's likely to quickly commit a serious violent or sexual offence, which may endanger or end the life of someone else, most likely a woman, and that him relapsing into alcohol and drug use would be a massive red flag that something was about to happen, as it makes behaviour more unpredictable. Such an assessment would mean stricter oversight, more conditions, and less chances before being sent back to prison. It would also mean that McSweeney potentially should have been placed in a probation hostel, which is accommodation staffed 24 hours a day, where every move until the offender is monitored. This is reserved for the most risky offenders, who are forced to live there and have to be back inside by a certain time each evening. This means any concerns can be acted on quickly, but also, if they disappear, recall can be started immediately, which involves their licence being revoked and a warrant issued for their arrest. The police then pick them up and take them back to prison. However, this wasn't the view of the probation officer in this case. They assessed that Jordan McSweeney posed what's known as a medium risk of serious harm. What that essentially means is that his risk factors were currently stable, and therefore he was unlikely to commit a serious offence soon after coming out of prison. This is a staggering line of thinking, given what we know about Jordan McSweeney. This meant no long list of conditions, no residing in a probation hostel, where he could be monitored closely and would be given more chances than he should in the community before finally being returned to prison. So on the 17th of June 2022, Jordan McSweeney was released from prison. It appears there was no clarity on his release plans, and his case was allocated to London probation, as he'd made some vague comments about wishing to relocate back to Dagenham, where he was originally from, as his mother had moved back to the area. His first duty from prison, as with any prison release, was to attend a probation office. He failed to do so. A few hours later, probation got a call from McSweeney's mother, saying he'd turned up at her house and he was drunk and unconscious. McSweeney was given another chance, and a message was passed to him to attend the probation office sober on the 20th of June 2022. Now, in 99% of cases, if someone doesn't turn up on the day of their release, they'll be recalled immediately. Why this didn't happen in this case is unclear. On the 20th of June, McSweeney failed to show up. He was given a third opportunity, with a letter being sent to his mother's address to attend on the 22nd of June 2022. It was soon established that McSweeney's mother had not seen him since the day of his release. His whereabouts were completely unknown. To no one's surprise, he'd missed his appointment on the 22nd of June 2022, meaning the decision was finally taken to recall him back to prison. This process, at a maximum, should have been completed within 24 hours, but for some inexplicable reason, this was not signed off by a senior manager until the 24th of June, 48 hours later. This meant that although he'd not been in contact with probation for a week, and no one had any idea where he was or what he was doing, it wasn't until 4:10 p.m. on the 24th of June 2022, just a day and a half before the murder, that Jordan McSweeney's license was officially revoked and a warrant issued for his arrest, enabling the police to begin looking for him and then take him back to prison. Of course, the police were on the back foot. They had no idea where McSweeney was. As I've already outlined, I know to them, and to the very people who should have been managing his risk, this dangerous career criminal had spent almost every hour since his release in an alcohol and drug-induced stupor and had been allowed to stay in a friend's caravan in Valentine's Park in Ilford. This is the location for where he would walk into town to start his campaign of predatory sexual behaviour towards women on the 25th of June and return to in the early hours of the next day after murdering Zara Aleena. The report about probation's oversight of this case was scathing. It's clear that Jordan McSweeney should have been assessed as high risk and recalled to prison on day one and not allowed to roam the streets. Of course, we'll never know, had this happened, if Zara Aleena's life could have been saved. The police would still have to have found him, but they would have been given a week to do this, and not just a day and a half. Personally, I think that Jordan McSweeney would have likely been safely behind bars at the time he killed Zara Aleena if he'd been recalled back to prison on the first day. It appears that due to chronic understaffing within London probation, McSweeney's case was given to an inexperienced officer. Unfortunately, the probation service, like many government-funded agencies, is completely underfunded. Despite money being available to pay for pay rises for MPs, there's apparently no money to recruit, train and maintain staff in a variety of professions which have a direct impact on helping and even saving lives, including doctors, nurses, teachers, the police, probation, etc. This is not to make excuses. More should have been done in this case without a doubt, but it does appear that chronic underfunding of agencies, despite serious issues being highlighted, continues. These things keep happening. The nation was shocked by the brutal and senseless murder of Zara Aleena. A silent vigil was held at the spot where she was attacked in July 2022, and attended by hundreds of people who'd come to pay their respects. Another vigil was held on the anniversary of her death in June 2023. However, those who always need to be remembered in these horrific cases are the family of the victim. Those people who likely spoke to Zara just hours before her death, who said goodbye to her before her night out and never saw her alive again. We then got a knock on the door, which represented the start of them serving their own life sentences. Zara's family released the following tribute, which I want to read out in full. Quote, Zara, 35, a beloved human, child, niece, cousin, granddaughter, friend to all. She was a joy to all of us. She was a carer for her mother and her grandmother. Caring for others came so naturally to her. Zara was friendly. She was everybody's friend. She was everybody's daughter, everybody's niece, everybody's sister, everybody's cousin. She was pure of heart. She was a joy to all of us, her sparkling eyes and curly jet black hair, her glorious laughter and her sweet smiling voice. Her tiny frame embodied a passionate spirit and indomitable energy. Zara was brought up by the whole family. She was our love in human form. At the age of 5, she said she was going to be a lawyer. Shrieking with joy when she spotted the birds as a child, she would giggle and make us laugh. She was always the bigger person in any situation. She was authentic and refused to try and impress anyone, but she impressed us. She was the rock of our family. Zara was stoic and held it all together and never complained. She glued our community together. Nobody worked harder than Zara, is what we heard from all who knew her. Zara was happy, and there was a point in her life when her joy was radiating and blossoming. She was ready to make a family of her own. Her sense of justice and fairness led her to a life of giving and caring for others, supporting refugees fleeing violence, giving voice to those who had less power. She had that special habit of noticing others in need and always put their needs on her agenda, a carefree spirit with the most caring heart. Zara was happy, and at a point in her life that she had worked hard for, she had completed her legal practice course so that she could practice as a solicitor. She only recently started working for the Royal Courts of Justice to complete her 2-year work placement in order to become a fully qualified solicitor. She was fierce. She didn't just survive, she thrived. She walked everywhere. She put her party shoes in a bag and donned her trainers. She walked. Zara believed that a woman should be able to walk home. Now, her dreams of a family are shattered, her future brutally taken. Sadly, Zara is not the only one who's had their life taken at the hands of a stranger. We all know women should be safe on our streets. She was in the heart of her community, 10 minutes from home. We all need to be talking about what happened to our Zara. We all need to be talking about this tragedy. These last few days have been shocking and unimaginable. In a savage, sickening act, she was murdered by a stranger. She's not the only woman who has lost her life like this. In the moments of this tragedy, we extend our deepest sympathy and love to the families of Bibba Henry, Nicole Sporman, Sarah Everard, Sabina Nessa, Aisling Murphy, and many more women. We must prevent and stop violence against women and girls. Our loss is irreparable, and the void feels insurmountable. But the warmth and kindness that our community has shown is testament to the power of Zara's spirit. Her life has been stolen from us. She has been stolen from all of us. Rest in power, Zara, Natasha Aleena. Even in the depths of their pain, the family of Zara wanted to acknowledge the names of other women who have been murdered by male strangers, and they issued a call to action to stop other families from having to go through the pain that they will inevitably experience each and every day for the rest of their lives. Their bravery is something that I think all of us should have massive respect for. I also fully support their message. Violence against women and girls must stop. People like Zara should not fear simply walking down the street in their own town. She must also never be forgotten. Rest in peace, Zara. Jordan McSweeney is unfortunately, like almost all of the people I cover, a product of shitty parenting. He was neglected, exposed to violence repeatedly, and was able to do whatever he wanted without consequence. The only things he was taught was that violence solves everything, that he should be allowed to do whatever he wanted. In addition, during his childhood, he developed a hatred of women. This inevitably stemmed from his mother, and likely included the fact that she didn't look after him or protect him from the revolving door of abusive men she brought into the home. I've read that Jordan McSweeney has a personality disorder, although I cannot find any record of which one or how many he may have. But I imagine he has antisocial personality disorder, given his repeated rule-breaking, complete disregard for the welfare of others, persistent dishonesty, and from what I've read, no real guilt or remorse for his behaviour. He also believed that he was entitled to take anything he wanted. If he needed money, he'd break into somewhere or rob someone. People in Jordan McSweeney's life were only there for one thing, to cater to him. Even people he considered friends were not off limits. He seemed proud stabbing them in the back to get what he wanted. McSweeney was a user, pure and simple. He had no desire to add anything to the world, only to take as much as possible. His hatred of women, pro-violent attitudes, and belief he could do whatever he wanted are the integral elements to understanding Jordan McSweeney. He would use violence towards anyone who got in his way, but women, they were beneath him, unless a form of life, and if they displeased him in any way, or did not give him what he wanted, then he would utterly brutalise them. How dare they say no to him? No doubt the abuse he subjected Samantha Bryan to followed this template. If she even so much as put a foot out of place, he would beat her, stabbing on her head, not only to punish her, but also using her as a way to take out all of his anger and hatred towards women in general. In my opinion, the only reason why Jordan McSweeney did not kill a woman earlier was because he spent most of his adult life in prison. This fact also shows us that he had no real connection with society. Each time he was released, it was just another opportunity to get high and drunk as quickly as possible before inevitably being sent back. And that was his mentality when he was released in June 2022, just 9 days before murdering Zara. Instantly, he got drunk. The party to him had just started. Might as well enjoy it until I end up back inside again. On the 25th June, he was looking for sex and would not take no for an answer. He began in a pub, made advances towards women. They rejected him, and I imagine this increased his anger significantly. They had no right to turn him down. So he took to the streets, and it's clear that his intention was to find someone to rape. No one says no to Jordan McSweeney. With each woman he followed and who got away, his anger inevitably increased, especially with regards to the last woman he followed. He'd hidden himself and was ready to attack, but she'd escaped. And then he saw Zara Aleena, and he decided she would be his victim. She was not a woman to him. She was a thing, a piece of meat he could use and abuse to gain gratification. He then followed and attacked her. The savagery of the attack is almost beyond belief. I think this was fueled by his anger, those previous attempts to attack women had come to nothing, his hatred of all women generally, but also the fact that Zara dared to try and fight him off. In his sick mind, she should have submitted to what he wanted, because it was what he was entitled to. He then returned to Zara repeatedly, using horrific and gratuitous violence on her, stamping on her head again and again and again. McSweeney aiming at her head and coming back to inflict more damage to this area shows the level of hatred for women that he truly had. He aimed at this area, in my opinion, to completely obliterate Zara's face, to destroy her identity entirely, his punishment to her for daring to be a gender that he despised so much. Jordan McSweeney is a monster and an utter coward who was too weak to even face his own punishment. I imagine he still has no remorse for his behavior. I hope that he's never released. He is a man who believes the rules do not apply to him and that people are merely there for him to use, abuse, violate and kill. If he ever sees freedom again, I think within days of being released, he would likely commit another murder. Jordan McSweeney is a truly evil man who fully deserves to end his days behind prison walls. Octavia and Oscar Fairweather's love story began like a fairy tale. They met as undergraduates at Creekside College, where Octavia studied art and Oscar pursued a degree in business administration. Octavia captivated Oscar from the moment he saw her by the campus lake. Oscar, tall and charismatic with a disarming smile, wooed Octavia with his charm and ambition. They married shortly after graduation, with dreams of building a life together in their hometown. Octavia secured a position as an art teacher at high school, where her passion for creativity and nurturing young talent quickly made her a favorite among students and faculty alike. Oscar, leveraging his family connections, landed a job at a prestigious local investment firm, climbing the corporate ladder with remarkable speed. As the years passed, the Fairweathers became pillars of the Creekside community. They were fixtures at galas and town council meetings. Their home in Oakwood Estates, purchased with Oscar's growing wealth, became a symbol of their success. Octavia's artistic touch was evident in every room, from the hand-painted murals in the living room to the carefully curated sculptures in their backyard. To the outside world, Octavia and Oscar were the epitome of a power couple. They complemented each other perfectly. Octavia's creativity balancing Oscar's business acumen, her warmth softening his sometimes brusque demeanor. Friends often remarked on how they still looked at each other with the same adoration they had in college. Yet beneath the surface of this picture-perfect life, there were undercurrents of tension. Octavia and Oscar had been trying to conceive for years without success. The strain of fertility treatments and dashed hopes began to wear on their relationship. Oscar threw himself into his work, spending long hours at the office, while Octavia found solace in her art and her students. It was during this challenging time that Octavia's relationship with her mother, Cordelia Prescott, became a source of comfort and support. Cordelia, a widow who lived on the outskirts of town, had always been a free spirit. In her youth, she had traveled the world as a photojournalist, settling down in Creekside only after meeting Octavia's father. After his passing, Cordelia had retreated into a quieter life, focusing on her garden and her volunteer work at the local animal shelter. As Octavia spent more time with her mother, Oscar found himself drawn into Cordelia's orbit as well. What began as polite conversation during family dinners slowly evolved into something more, setting the stage for a betrayal that would tear the Fairweather family apart. The seeds of the affair between Oscar and Cordelia were planted on a crisp autumn evening. Octavia, consumed with preparing for an upcoming art exhibition featuring her students' work, Oscar, feeling neglected and frustrated by the growing distance in his marriage, decided to go to Cordelia's cottage alone, ostensibly to check on his mother-in-law. Cordelia, surprised but pleased by the unexpected visit, welcomed Oscar with a warm smile and a glass of her homemade wine. As they sat in her small, cluttered living room, surrounded by eclectic souvenirs from her travels, Oscar found himself opening up about his marital troubles. Cordelia listened with empathy, her eyes, so similar to Octavia's, filled with understanding. Perhaps it was the wine, or the intimate atmosphere, or simply the need for human connection. But that night a line was crossed. A comforting touch lingered too long. The gaze held more meaning than it should have. By the time Oscar left Cordelia's cottage, both knew that something had irrevocably changed. In the weeks that followed, Oscar and Cordelia manufactured reasons to see each other. Cordelia suddenly needed help with home repairs, while Oscar discovered a newfound interest in gardening. Their clandestine meetings became more frequent, always carefully timed to avoid suspicion. During one of their early encounters, Oscar arrived at Cordelia's cottage to help fix a leaky faucet. As they worked side by side in the cramped space of her bathroom, the air between them grew thick with unspoken tension. Their hands brushed accidentally, sending electric shocks through both of them. When Cordelia reached past Oscar for a towel, he caught the scent of her perfume, a heady mix of jasmine and vanilla that made his head swim. Their eyes met in the mirror, and for a moment neither could look away. On a warm Sunday afternoon, Cordelia was showing Oscar how to prune her rose bushes. As she demonstrated the technique, standing close behind him to guide his hands, both were acutely aware of their physical proximity. The gentle brush of her breath on his neck, the warmth of her body against his back, sent shivers down Oscar's spine. When he turned to ask a question, their faces were inches apart. Time seemed to stand still as they stood there, frozen in a moment of forbidden desire. During a rare moment alone at a family gathering, Oscar and Cordelia stole away to the secluded garden behind the house. Hidden from view by a trellis covered in climbing roses, they gave in to their desires. Their kisses were urgent, hands roaming with a desperation born of stolen moments. As they heard Octavia's voice calling for them, they quickly separated, straightening their clothes and hair. The guilt was immediate, but so was the thrill of their secret affair, adding a dangerous excitement to their illicit encounters. Their affair consumed them, blinding them to the consequences of their actions. In Cordelia's bedroom, a space once reserved for solitary nights, they now created a world of secret passion. The creak of bed springs and hushed whispers became a symphony of their illicit love, playing out against the backdrop of familial betrayal. As their physical intimacy deepened, so too did their emotional entanglement. What had started as a physical attraction morphed into something more complex and dangerous. They began to imagine a future together, heedless of the devastation such dreams would wreak on their family. It was this combination of physical passion and emotional connection that would ultimately lead to their undoing. They justified their actions in whispered conversations. Oscar spoke of feeling unappreciated and misunderstood by Octavia, while Cordelia confessed to a loneliness that had plagued her since her husband's death. They convinced themselves that their connection was special, something that transcended the boundaries of the conventional. As the affair deepened, so did their web of lies. Oscar began to invent business trips and late meetings. Cordelia feigned illness to avoid family gatherings. They communicated through a secret email account and disposable phones, always careful to cover their tracks. But with each deception, the weight of guilt grew heavier. Oscar found it increasingly difficult to look Octavia in the eye, while Cordelia's interactions with her daughter became strained and awkward. The very relationship that had once been Octavia's source of comfort was now tainted by betrayal. Neither Oscar nor Cordelia could have foreseen the devastating consequences their actions would have on the entire Fairweather family. As they continued their illicit liaison, they remained oblivious to the suspicions beginning to form in Octavia's mind. The first inkling that something was amiss came to Octavia on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She had decided to surprise Oscar with lunch at his office, only to be told by his confused secretary that he had left early, mentioning a meeting with a client. Octavia brushed it off as a miscommunication, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Over the following weeks, Octavia began to notice subtle changes in Oscar's behavior. He was more distracted, often lost in thought during their conversations. His phone would buzz at odd hours, and he would step out of the room to take calls in hushed tones. When questioned, Oscar would dismiss her concerns with vague explanations about work stress and important deals in the pipeline. Octavia's artistic sensitivity, usually a source of joy in her life, now became a curse as she picked up on minute details that others might have missed. The faint scent of unfamiliar perfume on Oscar's clothes, a lipstick smudge on a coffee mug he brought home from the office, the way he sometimes avoided her touch. All these observations accumulated in her mind, forming a picture she didn't want to see. Her relationship with her mother also began to change. Cordelia, once eager to spend time with her daughter, now seemed distant and preoccupied. Their weekly tea sessions became less frequent, with Cordelia often canceling at the last minute, citing various commitments. When they did meet, Octavia sensed a nervousness in her mother's demeanor, a reluctance to meet her eyes that was entirely out of character. As her suspicions grew, Octavia found herself trapped in a spiral of doubt and self-recrimination. She questioned every interaction, analyzed every word spoken by Oscar and Cordelia. Was she imagining things? Had the stress of their fertility struggles and her upcoming exhibition made her paranoid? Determined to find the truth, Octavia began to investigate discreetly. She checked Oscar's credit card statements, noting several charges at restaurants and hotels that he had never mentioned. She drove by her mother's cottage at odd hours, her heart sinking when she spotted Oscar's car parked down the street on an evening when he was supposedly working late. Each new piece of evidence felt like a physical blow, chipping away at the foundation of trust that had been the bedrock of her life. Octavia's students and colleagues noticed the change in her demeanor, the dark circles under her eyes, the tremor in her hands as she demonstrated brush techniques, the forced smile that never quite reached her eyes. As the days passed, Octavia became a shadow of her former self, torn between confronting her fears and clinging to the last shreds of hope that she was mistaken. Little did she know that the truth, when it finally came to light, would be even more devastating than she could have imagined. The day Octavia's world shattered began like any other. It was a Saturday, and she had spent the morning at the school, putting the finishing touches on the student art exhibition. Oscar had left early, mumbling something about a golf game with clients. As Octavia drove home, her mind preoccupied with last-minute details for the upcoming show, she decided on a whim to stop by her mother's cottage. Perhaps a cup of tea and a chat would help calm her nerves. As Octavia turned onto the quiet lane leading to Cordelia's home, her heart nearly stopped. There parked behind was Oscar's sleek black sedan. For a moment, Octavia sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel. She told herself there could be an innocent explanation, but deep down she knew. With trembling legs, Octavia approached the cottage. The curtains were drawn, but through a gap she could see movement inside. Taking a deep breath, she used her key to unlock the door, pushing it open as quietly as possible. The sight that greeted her would be forever seared into her memory. There on the floral-patterned couch, they were locked in an intimate embrace. Oblivious to the world around them, Cordelia's hair was disheveled, Oscar's shirt partially unbuttoned. On the coffee table, 2 half-empty wine glasses stood as mute witnesses to their betrayal. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, as if sensing her presence, Oscar and Cordelia looked up. The expressions on their faces, shock, guilt, and a flicker of defiance. What followed was a blur of emotions and accusations. Octavia's anguished cry broke the silence, startling the guilty pair. Oscar jumped to his feet, stammering excuses and pleas. Cordelia remained seated, her face ashen, tears streaming down her cheeks. Octavia, her voice raw with pain and fury, hurled questions at them. The answers, when they came, were like daggers to her heart. 6 months. It had started as friendship, then evolved. They hadn't meant for it to happen. They were sorry. Unable to bear their presence any longer, Octavia fled the cottage. She drove aimlessly for hours, her mind replaying the scene over and over. By the time she returned home, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn of the house she had once considered her sanctuary. As she sat in the darkened living room, surrounded by the trappings of her seemingly perfect life, Octavia felt something inside her break. The pain, the betrayal, the sheer magnitude of the deception. In that moment, a cold resolve began to form in her heart. Someone would have to pay for this betrayal, and Octavia knew exactly who that someone would be. The events leading up to the fatal shooting unfolded over several tense hours on that warm summer evening. Octavia, having spent the day in a haze of grief and anger, found herself pacing the halls of her home like a caged animal. The tick of the clock in the foyer seemed to mock her, counting down the moments until her world would irrevocably change. As dusk fell, Oscar returned home. He entered cautiously, his usual confident stride replaced by hesitant steps. Octavia watched from the shadows of the dining room as he hung up his jacket and loosened his tie, the familiar routine now tainted by the knowledge of his betrayal. Oscar called out Octavia's name, his voice strained with apprehension. When she stepped into the light, he visibly flinched. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the vibrant, loving wife he had known. Octavia's eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, her posture rigid with barely contained fury. Oscar, his face a mask of guilt and desperation, launched into a litany of excuses and apologies. He spoke of feeling neglected, of the pressures of work and their fertility struggles. He claimed the affair had been a mistake, a moment of weakness that had spiraled out of control. With each word, Octavia felt her anger rising, a tide of rage threatening to overwhelm her. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Octavia found herself walking to Oscar's study. She knew he kept a handgun in the desk drawer, a precaution he had insisted on after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood. As if in a trance, she retrieved the weapon, feeling its cold weight in her hand. When she returned to the living room, Oscar's eyes widened in shock and fear. He raised his hands, backing away slowly, his words now coming in a panicked rush. He promised to end the affair, to go to counseling, to do whatever it took to save their marriage. But Octavia barely heard him. In her mind, she saw only images of Oscar and Cordelia together, their betrayal playing on an endless loop. What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. Oscar lunged forward, perhaps trying to disarm her. In that moment of chaos and heightened emotion, Octavia's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the confines of the room, followed by an eerie silence, broken only by the tinkling of shattered glass from a fallen picture frame. Oscar staggered backward, a look of disbelief on his face as he pressed his hand to his chest. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining his crisp white shirt crimson. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his eyes locked on Octavia's in a silent plea. As the reality of what she had done crashed over her, Octavia dropped the gun. It clattered to the hardwood floor, the sound jolting her out of her shocked state. She rushed to Oscar's side, her anger instantly replaced by horror and regret. She pressed her hands against the wound, desperately trying to stem the flow of blood. Oscar's breathing was labored, his skin growing pale. With trembling hands, Octavia reached for her phone, dialing 911. Her voice shook as she gave the dispatcher their address, pleading for an ambulance to hurry. As she waited for help to arrive, she cradled Oscar's head in her lap, whispering a mixture of apologies and pleas for him to hold on. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Neighbors, alerted by the gunshot, began to gather outside. Through the window, Octavia could see curious faces peering in, their expressions shifting from concern to shock as they took in the scene. She heard muffled voices, someone shouting about calling the police. When the paramedics finally arrived, they worked swiftly to stabilize Oscar. Octavia watched, numb with shock, as they loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to the waiting ambulance. As the sirens faded into the distance, Octavia found herself alone in the house, surrounded by the evidence of her actions. It wasn't long before the police arrived. Detective Mia Davis took charge of the scene, her keen eyes taking in every detail. As officers secured the area and began collecting evidence, Detective Davis approached Octavia, who sat motionless on the blood-stained couch. In a gentle but firm voice, Detective Davis informed Octavia of her rights and asked if she understood what had happened. Octavia, her voice barely audible, recounted the events of the day, the discovery of the affair, the confrontation, and the moment the gun went off. Throughout her statement, she seemed almost detached, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. As Octavia was led away in handcuffs, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. She caught glimpses of her neighbors watching from behind hastily drawn curtains, their faces a mix of horror and fascination. At the General Hospital, Oscar Fairweather clung to life in the intensive care unit. The bullet had missed his heart by mere inches, lodging dangerously close to his spine. As he underwent multiple surgeries, a steady stream of colleagues and family friends visited, their hushed conversations in the waiting room filled with speculation and disbelief. Cordelia Prescott, racked with guilt and shame, attempted to visit her son-in-law but was turned away by the Fairweather family. She retreated to her cottage, refusing to answer calls or open her door. The weight of her role in the tragedy seemed to age her overnight, her once vibrant demeanor replaced by a haunted, hollow-eyed look. Detective Davis, meanwhile, delved deeper into the case. She interviewed friends, colleagues, and family members, piecing together the events that had led to that fateful night. The more she uncovered about the Fairweather family's history and the affair between Oscar and Cordelia, the more complex the case became. As the investigation progressed, public opinion in Creekside began to shift. What had initially been seen as a clear-cut case of attempted murder in a fit of rage was revealed to be a tragedy born of betrayal and shattered trust. The town found itself divided, with some sympathizing with Octavia's plight, while others condemned her actions as inexcusable regardless of the circumstances. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence came from an unexpected source. Octavia's best friend and fellow art teacher, Zara, came forward with a series of text messages. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, Octavia had confided her growing suspicions to Zara, detailing the signs of infidelity she had noticed. The messages revealed Octavia's emotional turmoil and her struggle to confront the truth, providing valuable insight into her state of mind. Inside the packed courtroom, the air was thick with tension as the judge called the proceedings to order. The prosecution, led by the ambitious district attorney Vincent Harding, painted a picture of Octavia as a vengeful woman who had committed a premeditated act of violence. Harding argued that the shooting was not a crime of passion, but a calculated attempt to punish both her husband and her mother for their betrayal. Octavia's defense team, headed by the seasoned attorney, presented a different narrative. They portrayed Octavia as a victim of circumstances, a woman pushed to the brink by an unthinkable betrayal. Morales emphasized Octavia's impeccable character, her contributions to the community, and the extreme emotional distress she had been under at the time of the shooting. In their closing arguments, both the prosecution and defense made impassioned pleas to the jury. T.A. Harding emphasized the seriousness of the crime and the need for justice, while Morales urged the jurors to consider the extraordinary circumstances and Octavia's otherwise exemplary life. As the jury filed out to begin their deliberations, a hush fell over the courtroom. The fate of Octavia Fairweather now rested in their hands, and with it, the resolution of a tragedy that had shaken the town of Creekside to its core. After 3 days of intense deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Octavia Fairweather guilty of aggravated assault, a lesser charge than the attempted murder the prosecution had pushed for. The courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps and murmurs as the verdict was read, with Octavia standing stoically beside her attorney. The judge, taking into account Octavia's previously unblemished record and the extraordinary circumstances of the case, sentenced her to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. Additionally, Octavia was mandated to undergo psychological counseling and complete an anger management program. The sentence was met with mixed reactions. Some felt it was too lenient given the severity, while others believed it appropriately balanced justice with compassion. As Octavia was led away from the courtroom, the weight of her actions and the long road ahead seemed to finally settle on her shoulders. Oscar, having recovered from his physical wounds but forever changed by the experience, had moved to a different state to start anew. He and Octavia had divorced during her incarceration, their communication limited to formal letters and occasional phone calls. Despite the pain of their shared past, there was a tentative forgiveness between them, born of mutual understanding and regret. Cordelia had retreated from public life entirely. She lived as a virtual recluse in her cottage, her only contact with the outside world being the occasional visit from a home health aide. The weight of her role in the tragedy had taken a severe toll on her health and spirit. As Creekside slowly heals and life moves forward, the story of Octavia, Oscar, and Cordelia remains a powerful reminder of how quickly and irrevocably lives can change. It challenges us to examine our own relationships, to value the trust placed in us by our loved ones, and to consider the far-reaching impacts of our choices. The local high school in Oakville stood as a pillar of the community, shaping the minds of the town's youth for generations. It was here, in the fall of 2022, that a chilling series of events would unfold, forever shattering the town's sense of security and innocence. At the center of this harrowing tale were two individuals. Miranda Jarvis, a vibrant 18-year-old senior, was the epitome of small-town charm. With her long auburn hair, bright green eyes, and a smile that could light up a room, Miranda was beloved by her peers and teachers alike. She excelled in her studies, particularly in English literature, and harbored dreams of becoming a writer. Enter Mark Reynolds, a 32-year-old substitute teacher who arrived in Oakville with a mysterious past and a quiet demeanor that initially endeared him to the faculty and students. As the crisp autumn air settled over Oakville, no one could have predicted the dark storm brewing on the horizon. The story that unfolded over the following months would test the limits of human obsession, challenge the town's faith in its institutions, and leave an indelible mark on all those involved. This is the true account of how a substitute teacher's unhealthy fixation on a student spiraled into a nightmare that would haunt Oakville for years to come. Miranda Jarvis was born and raised in Oakville, the only child of James and Lucy Jarvis. Her father owned the local hardware store, while her mother worked as a nurse at the town's small hospital. From a young age, Miranda displayed a precocious intelligence and a vivid imagination that set her apart from her peers. Throughout her childhood and teenage years, Miranda's passion for literature and writing blossomed. She devoured classic novels, penned short stories, and kept a detailed journal of her thoughts and experiences. Her teachers often praised her insightful essays and creative writing pieces, predicting a bright future for the young wordsmith. Miranda's life wasn't without its challenges. In her sophomore year, her parents went through a rough patch in their marriage, leading to a brief separation. The experience deeply affected Miranda, and she channeled her emotions into her writing. Mark Reynolds' path to Oakville High School was far from conventional. Born in a bustling city on the East Coast, Mark had always been drawn to the world of literature and academia. He excelled in his studies, particularly in English and philosophy. Despite his academic achievements, Mark struggled to find his footing in the professional world. He began his career as a high school English teacher in his hometown, where he quickly gained a reputation for his engaging teaching style and deep knowledge of literature. However, after 3 years, Mark abruptly resigned from his position under mysterious circumstances. Rumors circulated about an inappropriate relationship with a student, but nothing was ever proven, and no charges were filed. Following this setback, Mark drifted from job to job, never staying in one place for too long. He worked as a copywriter, a bookstore clerk, and even tried his hand at writing a novel, but success eluded him. As the years passed, a sense of bitterness and resentment began to take root in Mark's psyche. He felt that the world had denied him the recognition and success he deserved. The crisp morning air of September 15, 2022, held no hint of the pivotal moment about to unfold within the walls of Oakville School. As students filed into Mrs. Henderson's advanced English literature class, a buzz of curiosity filled the room. Their regular teacher was out on maternity leave, and today they would meet their long-term substitute. Mark Reynolds stood at the front of the classroom. He introduced himself with a quiet confidence. As he began to discuss the semester's curriculum, focusing on Gothic literature, many students found themselves drawn in by his evident passion for the subject. It was during this introduction that Mark's eyes first fell on Miranda Jarvis. Seated in the second row, her hair catching the morning sunlight streaming through the windows, Miranda listened with rapt attention. When Mark posed a question about the themes in Edgar Allan Poe's works, Miranda's hand shot up, and she offered an insightful analysis that caught the substitute teacher off guard. Mark, impressed by her eloquence, engaged Miranda in a brief discussion about Poe's use of symbolism. As they talked, he noticed the spark of intelligence in her green eyes, the way she articulated her thoughts with a maturity beyond her years. For a moment, Mark felt a connection he hadn't experienced in years, the thrill of intellectual discourse with a kindred spirit. As the class progressed, Mark found his gaze repeatedly drawn to Miranda. He called on her often, each time feeling a small surge of excitement at her thoughtful responses. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Miranda lingered behind, approaching Mark's desk with a copy of her favorite Poe story, The Fall of the House of Usher. They engaged in a brief but animated discussion about the story's gothic elements and psychological undertones. As Miranda turned to leave, she smiled warmly at Mark, thanking him for the engaging class. Mark watched her go, a strange mix of emotions stirring within him: admiration, intrigue, and something darker that he couldn't quite name. That night, as Mark sat alone in his rented room, his thoughts kept drifting back to Miranda. He told himself it was merely the excitement of finding a promising student, someone who shared his passion for literature. But deep down, in a part of his psyche he dared not examine too closely, Mark knew that something had shifted. The seed of obsession had been planted, and it would soon grow into a twisted, all-consuming force that would change everything. In the weeks following that first encounter, Mark Reynolds' fixation on Miranda Jarvis grew at an alarming rate. Mark found himself looking forward to his advanced English literature class with an intensity that both thrilled and unsettled him. As September gave way to October, Mark's behavior began to change in subtle but significant ways. He started arriving at school earlier, hoping to catch a glimpse of Miranda in the hallways. He lingered in the teacher's lounge, eavesdropping on conversations about students, his ears perking up at any mention of her name. Mark's nights were increasingly consumed by thoughts of Miranda. He pored over her essays, reading and rereading them long after he had finished grading. He began to imagine conversations with her, picturing scenarios where they could interact outside of class. In his mind, Miranda understood him in a way no one else ever had. One evening, while grading papers, Mark came across a personal essay Miranda had written about her aspirations to become a writer. The raw honesty and vulnerability in her words struck a chord deep within him. That night, he crossed a line he had never dared to before. He searched for Miranda on social media. Mark spent hours scrolling through Miranda's public posts, absorbing every detail of her life outside of school. He learned about her favorite books, her hobbies, the cafes she frequented with her friends. Each new piece of information fed his growing obsession, making him feel closer to her. As his fixation intensified, Mark's teaching began to suffer. He would lose his train of thought mid-lecture, distracted by Miranda's presence. Other students noticed his frequent glances in her direction, the way his voice would soften when addressing her. Whispers and giggles sometimes rippled through the classroom, but Mark was oblivious to everything except Miranda. Outside of school, Mark's life began to revolve around his obsession. He started frequenting the local library where Miranda volunteered, pretending to browse books while watching her from afar. He would drive past her house on his way home, his heart racing at the thought of catching a glimpse of her through a window. Mark knew on some level that his behavior was inappropriate and potentially dangerous. There were moments of clarity when he would be struck by the magnitude of his obsession, and he would resolve to put it behind him. But these moments were fleeting, quickly overwhelmed by the intoxicating pull of his fixation on Miranda. As October drew to a close, Mark's obsession reached a fever pitch. He began to fantasize about a future with Miranda, convincing himself that she must feel the same connection he did. The line between reality and his twisted imagination blurred, setting the stage for the disturbing events that were about to unfold. The first truly alarming incident occurred on a chilly November afternoon. Miranda had stayed after class to discuss a paper with Mark, unaware of the tempest brewing within her teacher. As she gathered her things to leave, Mark impulsively reached out and touched her hand, ostensibly to take the paper she was handing him. The contact lasted only a second, but it sent a jolt through Mark's system. Miranda, startled by the unexpected touch, quickly withdrew her hand. She noticed a strange intensity in Mark's eyes that made her uncomfortable. Mumbling a hasty goodbye, she hurried out of the classroom, leaving Mark standing there, his hand still tingling from the brief contact. That evening, Miranda confided in her best friend Lily about the odd interaction. While Lily brushed it off as nothing serious, Miranda couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it left her with. She resolved to be more cautious around Mr. Reynolds, but didn't want to make a big deal out of what could have been an innocent mistake. Mark, on the other hand, spent the night reliving that moment of contact. In his mind, it became a significant event, a sign that his feelings for Miranda were reciprocated. 2 weeks after the hand-touching incident, Mark's behavior took an even more concerning turn. During lunch period, he overheard Miranda telling a friend about a poetry reading at a local bookstore that evening. Unable to resist the temptation, Mark decided to attend. That night, he sat in the back of the dimly lit bookstore, watching as Miranda and her friends arrived. Throughout the reading, Mark's eyes never left Miranda. He observed every laugh, every thoughtful nod, every whispered comment to her friends. In his mind, he was sharing the experience with her, part of her world. As the event ended and people began to leave, Miranda spotted Mark. Surprise and a flicker of unease crossed her face. She approached him hesitantly, asking if he had enjoyed the reading. Mark, caught off guard, stumbled through a response, his usual eloquence deserting him. Miranda quickly excused herself, visibly uncomfortable. As she left with her friends, Mark overheard her whispering, "He's everywhere lately. It's kind of creepy." The words hit Mark like a physical blow, but instead of serving as a wake-up call, they only intensified his obsession. The situation reached a critical point in early December. Miranda had been avoiding staying after class and tried to minimize her interactions with Mark. Frustrated and increasingly desperate, Mark made a decision that would irreversibly cross the line. Using the emergency contact information from the school records, Mark obtained Miranda's home address. One evening, he drove to her house, parking down the street. He sat there for hours, watching the Jarvis residence, imagining Miranda inside going about her evening routine. As luck would have it, Miranda stepped out to take out the trash. When she spotted Mark's car, recognition dawned on her face, quickly followed by fear. She hurried back inside, locking the door behind her. Panicked, Mark drove away, his mind racing. He knew he had gone too far, but he couldn't stop himself. The next day at school, Miranda was absent. When she returned the following day, she looked pale and avoided eye contact with Mark. Unbeknownst to Mark, Miranda had reported the incident to her parents and the school principal. An investigation was quietly launched, but before any action could be taken, the situation would take a dramatic and tragic turn. The morning of December 15, 2022, dawned cold and gray in Oakville. As families across town began their daily routines, Lucy Jarvis knocked on her daughter's bedroom door, calling out that breakfast was ready. When she received no response, Lucy opened the door, expecting to find Miranda still asleep. Instead, she was met with an empty, undisturbed bed. Panic quickly set in as Lucy and James Jarvis searched their home, calling Miranda's name. Her car was still in the driveway, her phone left on her nightstand. There was no sign of forced entry, no note left behind. It was as if Miranda had simply vanished into thin air. The Jarvis immediately called the police, and within hours, the quiet town of Oakville was transformed into a hive of activity. Police cars patrolled the streets, and search parties were organized to comb through nearby woods and parks. As the search for Miranda Jarvis entered its second week, the Oakville Police Department's investigation shifted into high gear. Detective Lucy Reeves, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving complex cases, took the lead. Her first order of business was to re-interview everyone in Miranda's life, starting with her closest friends and family. Lily Thompson recounted to Detective Reeves the growing unease Miranda had expressed about Mr. Reynolds' behavior in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. She mentioned the incident at the poetry reading and Miranda's discomfort with Mr. Reynolds' increasing presence in her life. On December 23rd, Detective Reeves brought Mark Reynolds in for formal questioning. In the stark interrogation room of the police station, Mark sat across from Reeves, his usual composure noticeably shaken. Detective Reeves began the interview casually, asking about Mark's background and his time at Oakville School. As the questions turned to his relationship with Miranda, Mark's responses became increasingly evasive. He denied any inappropriate behavior, insisting that his interest in Miranda was purely academic. But when confronted with evidence of his presence outside Miranda's house the night before her disappearance, Mark's facade began to crack. He stammered through an explanation about wanting to drop off some books for Miranda to read over the winter break. But his story was full of inconsistencies. As the interrogation wore on, Detective Reeves noticed Mark's right hand constantly fidgeting with something in his pocket. When asked to empty his pockets, Mark hesitated before reluctantly pulling out a delicate silver charm bracelet. With a sinking feeling, Reeves recognized it as the bracelet Miranda was wearing in the most recent photos her parents had provided. Mark's possession of Miranda's personal item was damning. He was immediately arrested on suspicion of involvement in Miranda's disappearance. As he was led away in handcuffs, Mark maintained his innocence, his eyes wild with a mix of fear and something darker that sent chills down Detective Reeves' spine. The news of Mark Reynolds' arrest sent shockwaves through Oakville. The community struggled to reconcile the image of the quiet, intellectual substitute teacher with the disturbing allegations against him. Parents demanded answers from the school board about how such a person had been allowed to teach their children. As the investigation continued, police executed a search warrant on Mark's rented room. Hidden in a locked drawer, detectives discovered a journal filled with rambling entries about Miranda. The evidence painted a chilling picture of Mark's deteriorating mental state and his unhealthy fixation on Miranda. But one crucial question remained unanswered. Where was Miranda Jarvis? Despite Mark's arrest and the damning evidence against him, there was still no trace of the missing girl. One entry, dated December 14th, caught Detective Reeves' attention. In it, Mark wrote about a special place where he and Miranda could be together forever, away from the judgmental eyes of the world. The entry was vague, but it mentioned an abandoned property on the outskirts of town. Acting on this lead, police conducted a thorough search of abandoned buildings in the area. On December 27th, their efforts paid off when they discovered an old dilapidated cabin deep in the woods outside Oakville. As officers approached the cabin, they noticed signs of recent activity, fresh tire tracks in the mud and a faint smell of smoke from the chimney. With hearts racing, the police team breached the cabin. Inside, they found evidence of someone living there recently. Food wrappers, a makeshift bed, and most disturbingly, several of Miranda's personal items scattered around the room. But there was no sign of Miranda herself. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds remained in custody, stubbornly maintaining his innocence despite the mounting evidence against him. During interrogations, he alternated between proclaiming his love for Miranda and insisting that he was being framed. His erratic behavior led the district attorney to order a psychological evaluation. Volunteers joined the police in searching the woods, hoping to find any trace of Miranda. In a surprising turn of events, on December 30th, Lily Thompson came forward with new information. Trembling and visibly distressed, she revealed to Detective Reeves that she had been withholding crucial details out of fear and misplaced loyalty. Philly recounted a conversation she had with Miranda just days before her disappearance. Miranda had confided in her about a secret online relationship she had been having with someone she met in a writing forum. This revelation shifted the focus of the investigation. While Mark Reynolds remained a person of interest, the police now had to consider the possibility that Miranda's disappearance was connected to this mysterious online figure. The IP address used by the user in the writing forum was traced back to a computer in the Oakville School Library. Cross-referencing the times of the online interactions with the school's records, Reeves found that they coincided perfectly with Mark Reynolds' free periods. This revelation cast the entire case in a new light. Mark hadn't just been obsessing over Miranda from afar. He had been actively manipulating her, creating a false persona to gain her trust and lure her into a meeting. Armed with this new information, Reeves confronted Mark in another intense interrogation. Initially, he tried to maintain his innocence, but as Reeves laid out the evidence piece by piece, Mark's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. In a chilling moment, Mark's demeanor suddenly shifted. Gone was the nervous, protesting teacher, replaced by a cold, calculating individual. With an unsettling calmness, he began to reveal the full extent of his deception. Mark admitted to creating the online persona months earlier. Long before he came to Oakville, he had been grooming Miranda online, gaining her trust and fueling her dreams of becoming a writer. It was just after dawn when a search dog picked up a scent. Following the dog's lead, rescuers pushed deeper into the forest, hope and dread warring in their hearts. As they crested a small hill, they spotted a flash of color against the dull winter landscape: Miranda's bright blue jacket. Miranda Jarvis was found huddled in the hollow of an old oak tree, cold, dehydrated, and terrified, but alive. As Miranda recovered in the hospital, surrounded by her overjoyed parents and a protective police presence, the full story of her ordeal came to light. She recounted how she had agreed to meet mysterious online user at the cabin, believing it to be a surprise arranged by a supportive mentor. The shock and terror she felt upon discovering Mark's true identity drove her to flee into the woods, where she had been wandering and hiding for over 2 weeks, surviving on stream water and whatever edible plants she could recognize. The aftermath of Miranda's rescue and Mark's arrest was far-reaching. The school faced intense scrutiny over its hiring practices and student protection policies. Several administrators resigned in the wake of the scandal, and the school board implemented stringent new background check procedures for all staff. Mark was convicted on multiple charges, including kidnapping, stalking, and child endangerment. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, without the possibility of parole. For Miranda and her family, the road to recovery was long and challenging. Miranda underwent extensive therapy to deal with the trauma of her experience. She found solace in writing, using her journal to process her emotions, and eventually turning her story into a powerful memoir that would go on to help other survivors of stalking and abuse. As for Oakville, the town would never be quite the same. The innocence of small-town life had been shattered, replaced by a wary vigilance. Yet in the face of this tragedy, the community had come together, demonstrating the power of collective action and the resilience of the human spirit. The case of Miranda Jarvis and Mark Reynolds serves as a chilling reminder of the dark undercurrents that can exist beneath the surface of even the most seemingly idyllic communities. It highlights the vulnerability of young people in an increasingly connected world, and the insidious ways in which predators can manipulate and exploit their victims. In the picturesque coastal town of Millhaven, where the salty breeze carries whispers of secrets and lies, a tragedy was brewing beneath the surface of everyday life. The quaint streets, lined with colorful boutiques and cozy cafes, masked a web of deceit that would soon unravel, leaving the community shaken to its core. At the heart of this tale are 3 individuals whose lives became inextricably intertwined. Lachlan Thorne, a man desperate for financial stability and respect. Zara Callahan, a talented chef with dreams bigger than the small town could contain. And Enzo Rossi, the charismatic owner of a popular Italian restaurant. To the outside world, Lachlan and Zara appeared to be the perfect couple, young and in love with a bright future ahead. Their engagement was the talk of the town, a beacon of hope in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming in their relationship, cracks that would soon split wide open. Enzo, with his easy charm and successful business, seemed to have it all. His restaurant was a local institution, and his marriage to Vivian, a respected member of the town council, was envied by many. Yet, behind closed doors, Enzo harbored his own dissatisfactions and desires. As summer faded into autumn, the stage was set for a series of events that would lead to betrayal, blackmail, and ultimately, bloodshed. The story of how these 3 lives collided is a cautionary tale of passion, greed, and the devastating consequences of keeping secrets in a town where the truth always finds its way to the surface. Lachlan Thorne's story began far from the shores of Millhaven, in a struggling mining town where dreams went to die. The youngest of 4 children, Lachlan grew up watching his father descend into the depths of the earth day after day, only to return home beaten down by the relentless toil. His mother, a part-time seamstress, struggled to keep the family afloat, her fingers constantly pricked by needles as she worked late into the night. From an early age, Lachlan vowed he would escape the cycle of poverty that had trapped his parents. He threw himself into his studies, earning a scholarship to a prestigious university in the city. But the transition from his humble beginnings to the world of academia proved more challenging than he anticipated. Surrounded by wealthy peers who seemed to navigate college life with ease, Lachlan felt like an outsider, constantly battling the feeling that he didn't belong. Despite his best efforts, Lachlan's insecurities began to manifest in self-destructive behaviors. He developed a gambling habit, convinced that one big win could solve all his problems. Instead, it left him deeper in debt, forcing him to take on multiple part-time jobs just to stay afloat. By the time he graduated, the promise of a bright future had dimmed considerably. Lachlan drifted from job to job, never quite finding his footing in the corporate world. His resume became a patchwork of short-term positions and gaps, each failure chipping away at his self-esteem. As his 30th birthday approached, he found himself back in a small town, not unlike the one he had tried so hard to escape. It was in Millhaven that Lachlan's luck seemed to change. He landed a job as a marketing manager for a local brewery, a position that finally allowed him to showcase his skills. More importantly, it was here that he met Zara Callahan. Their whirlwind romance offered Lachlan a glimpse of the life he had always dreamed of. Successful, respected, and loved. When he proposed to Zara after just 6 months of dating, Lachlan truly believed he had finally overcome his past. But old habits die hard, and the pressure to provide Zara with the life he thought she deserved began to weigh heavily on him. As wedding plans progressed, Lachlan found himself once again drawn to the false promise of easy money, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to tragedy. Zara Callahan's journey to Millhaven was paved with both passion and pain. Born to a free-spirited mother and an absent father, Zara spent her childhood bouncing between relatives' homes and short-term apartments. Her mother, Fiona, was a talented artist, but struggled with substance abuse, leaving young Zara to fend for herself more often than not. It was during one of their stays with Zara's maternal grandmother that she discovered her love for cooking. In her grandmother's warm, fragrant kitchen, Zara found solace and stability. She would spend hours watching the elderly woman transform simple ingredients into mouth-watering dishes, soaking up every technique and family recipe like a sponge. As Zara entered her teenage years, her mother's addiction worsened. At 15, Zara made the difficult decision to leave her mother's care, moving in permanently with her grandmother. It was a choice that haunted her, but one that allowed her to focus on her dreams. She threw herself into her culinary pursuits, working part-time at local restaurants while excelling in her high school's home economics classes. Zara's talent didn't go unnoticed. She earned a scholarship to a prestigious culinary school, where she honed her skills and developed her own unique style. Her instructors praised her innovative approach to traditional dishes, and her fellow students admired her dedication and creativity. However, just as Zara was about to graduate, tragedy struck. Her grandmother passed away suddenly, leaving Zara feeling unmoored once again. Grief-stricken and unsure of her next move, she deferred her dreams of working in a big city restaurant and returned to her grandmother's house in Millhaven. It was meant to be temporary, just long enough to settle her grandmother's affairs. But when she heard that the renowned restaurant was hiring, Zara saw an opportunity to gain experience while figuring out her next steps. She impressed Enzo Rossi with her skills and passion, and what was supposed to be a short-term position turned into years. Zara threw herself into her work, quickly rising through the ranks to become the restaurant's sous chef. She found a sense of family among her co-workers and began to put down roots in Millhaven. When she met Lachlan, it seemed like the final piece of her life was falling into place. Little did she know that the stability she had worked so hard to achieve was about to be shattered by a web of desire, deceit, and desperation. The restaurant stood as a testament to Enzo Rossi's unwavering ambition and culinary expertise. The restaurant, with its warm terracotta walls and the intoxicating aroma of authentic Italian cuisine, had been Enzo's dream since he first set foot in Millhaven 20 years ago. A first-generation immigrant, Enzo had arrived with little more than a suitcase full of his nonna's recipes and an unshakable determination to succeed. The early years were a struggle, with Enzo working grueling hours to establish his restaurant's reputation. His charm and culinary skills gradually won over the initially skeptical locals, and the restaurant became the go-to spot for everything from first dates to golden wedding anniversaries. Enzo took pride in knowing his regular customers by name, always ready with a warm smile and a perfectly paired wine recommendation. It was during this period of growing success that Enzo met Vivian, a local girl from a well-respected family. Their whirlwind romance culminated in a lavish wedding that was the talk of Millhaven for months. Vivian, with her sharp business acumen, helped streamline the restaurant's operations, allowing Enzo to focus on what he loved most, creating exquisite dishes in the kitchen. On the surface, Enzo appeared to have it all: a thriving business, a beautiful wife, and the respect of the community. He became a pillar of Millhaven society, sponsoring local events and mentoring aspiring chefs at the high school. His annual charity dinners were legendary, raising substantial funds for various community projects. However, as the years passed, cracks began to appear in Enzo's seemingly perfect life. The long hours at the restaurant took their toll on his marriage. Vivian, now deeply involved in local politics, had less and less time for the romantic gestures that had once characterized their relationship. Their conversations, once filled with dreams and laughter, became focused on business strategies and social obligations. Enzo found himself increasingly restless, yearning for the passion that seemed to have faded from his life. He threw himself into his work, constantly innovating and expanding the restaurant's menu. But even his beloved kitchen began to feel like a gilded cage, trapping him in a life that no longer brought him joy. As he approached his 50th birthday, Enzo felt a growing sense of dissatisfaction. He began to question the choices that had led him to this point, wondering if he had sacrificed too much of himself in pursuit of success. It was in this state of emotional vulnerability that Enzo first began to see Zara as more than just his talented sous chef, setting the stage for a relationship that would have far-reaching and ultimately tragic consequences. The spark between Enzo and Zara ignited on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening in late autumn. The restaurant was uncharacteristically quiet, with only a handful of patrons braving the stormy weather. As closing time approached, Enzo found himself alone in the kitchen with Zara, both of them working in comfortable silence to prepare for the next day. It was Zara who broke the quiet, suggesting a new twist on one of the restaurant's classic dishes. Enzo, intrigued, invited her to demonstrate. As they worked side by side, chopping herbs and sautéing vegetables, Enzo was struck by Zara's passion and creativity. Her eyes lit up as she explained her ideas, and Enzo found himself drawn in not just by her culinary skills, but by her vibrant energy. As they tasted the finished dish together, their eyes met over the steaming plate. In that moment, something shifted between them. Enzo, caught off guard by the intensity of his feelings, made a casual comment about the late hour and suggested they call it a night. But as Zara gathered her things to leave, a clap of thunder startled her, causing her to drop her bag. Enzo rushed to help, and as they both reached for the scattered contents, their hands touched. The physical contact, brief as it was, sent a jolt through both of them. Before either could fully process what was happening, they found themselves in each other's arms, sharing a passionate kiss that left them both breathless and confused. In the days that followed, Enzo and Zara tried to maintain a professional distance, but the tension between them was palpable. Stolen glances across the kitchen, lingering touches as they passed each other in the narrow hallways. It was only a matter of time before they gave in to their desires. Their first real encounter happened after hours in Enzo's office. What started as a discussion about the next season's menu quickly evolved into a heated expression of their pent-up passion. As they lay tangled together on the small leather sofa, both Enzo and Zara knew they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. For Zara, the affair was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The exhilaration of being with Enzo was constantly at war with her guilt over betraying Lachlan. She told herself it was just a physical thing, that her feelings for her fiancé remained unchanged. But as the weeks passed, she found herself increasingly drawn to Enzo, not just physically but emotionally as well. Enzo, for his part, felt rejuvenated by the relationship. With Zara, he rediscovered the passion he had been missing both in and out of the kitchen. He convinced himself that he deserved this happiness, that the years of dedication to his wife and his business entitled him to this secret indulgence. As summer turned to fall, their affair deepened, becoming more than just stolen moments of physical intimacy. Neither Enzo nor Zara were prepared for the storm that was brewing, threatening to destroy everything they had built. Lachlan Thorne prided himself on his ability to read people, a skill honed through years of navigating the corporate world. So when Zara's behavior began to change subtly, he noticed. It started with small things. She was working later hours, seemed distracted during their time together, and was constantly checking her phone. At first, Lachlan attributed it to the stress of wedding planning and her increased responsibilities at the restaurant. But as the weeks passed, a nagging suspicion began to take root in his mind. One evening, as they sat on opposite ends of the couch, ostensibly watching a movie together, Lachlan observed Zara smiling at her phone, her fingers flying across the screen as she typed out a message. When he casually asked who she was texting, Zara's response was too quick, too rehearsed. "A coworker?" she said, discussing a new recipe. But the flush on her cheeks and the way she quickly locked her phone told a different story. Determined to uncover the truth, Lachlan began to pay closer attention to Zara's schedule and movements. He noted the nights she came home particularly late, the weekends she claimed to be doing inventory at the restaurant. He even drove by the restaurant a few times, noting with growing unease that Zara's car was often the only one in the parking lot, besides Enzo's distinctive vintage Alfa Romeo. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on a crisp autumn evening. Lachlan, unable to shake his suspicions, decided to surprise Zara at work. As he approached the restaurant, he saw two figures silhouetted in the dim light of the kitchen. Through the window, he watched in stunned silence as Enzo pulled Zara close, their lips meeting in a passionate kiss. The sight hit Lachlan like a physical blow. He stumbled back to his car, his mind reeling. All the little inconsistencies, the late nights, the distracted behavior. It all made sense now. The woman he loved, the woman he had planned to spend his life with, was having an affair with her boss. As he sat in his car watching the restaurant, a toxic mixture of emotions coursed through him. Hurt, betrayal, anger, but also surprisingly a cold calculation. Lachlan had always prided himself on his ability to turn situations to his advantage, and as the initial shock wore off, his mind began to work. He thought about the upcoming wedding, the deposits they had already paid. He thought about the shame of calling it off, of admitting to friends and family that he had been deceived. And then he thought about the restaurant, about Enzo's wealth and success. A plan began to form in Lachlan's mind. If Zara thought she could betray him and get away with it, she was sorely mistaken. He would make her pay, quite literally, and in doing so, he would secure the financial stability he had always craved. As he started his car and drove away from the restaurant, Lachlan's hurt and betrayal hardened into resolve. Zara's infidelity would be her downfall, and his ticket to the life he deserved. Lachlan bided his time, carefully planning his next move. He needed irrefutable evidence before confronting Zara. Over the next week, he meticulously documented her comings and goings, even going so far as to plant a small voice-activated recorder in her car. It was an invasion of privacy that made him feel dirty, but he justified it as necessary, given the circumstances. When he finally had what he needed, a recording of Zara and Enzo in an intimate conversation that left no doubt about their relationship, Lachlan set his plan in motion. He chose a quiet Sunday morning, when Zara was relaxed and off guard, to spring his trap. "Lachlan, I know about you and Enzo," he said without preamble as Zara sipped her coffee. The mug slipped from her fingers, shattering on the kitchen floor. Her face, drained of color, told him everything he needed to know. What followed was a conversation filled with tears, recriminations, and desperate pleas. Zara begged for forgiveness, swearing that the affair meant nothing, that Lachlan was the one she truly loved. But Lachlan had steeled himself against her explanations. He laid out his terms coldly. If she wanted to keep their engagement intact and avoid the scandal of her affair being exposed, she would have to do exactly as he said. His demands were simple yet devastating. Zara would use her position at the restaurant to embezzle money, skimming from the daily takings and manipulating the books to cover her tracks. The amount would start small but increase over time. Lachlan framed it as restitution, compensation for the hurt and humiliation she had caused him. Zara, caught between her guilt and her fear of losing everything, reluctantly agreed. She rationalized that it would be temporary, that she could find a way out of this situation without anyone getting hurt. But deep down, she knew she had set foot on a dangerous path. The scheme began slowly. Zara, leveraging her trusted position and her access to the restaurant's financial systems, started by pocketing small amounts from the cash register, no more than $50 at a time. She meticulously altered the daily reports, adjusting inventory numbers and falsifying receipts to cover her tracks. Each time she handed the stolen money to Lachlan, she felt a piece of her soul crumble away. Lachlan, for his part, treated the whole affair with a chilling detachment. He set up a separate bank account to deposit the stolen funds, careful to keep the transactions below amounts that might trigger suspicion. To the outside world, he played the role of the doting fiancé, but in private, he was cold and demanding, constantly pressing Zara for more. As weeks turned into months, the amounts grew larger. Lachlan's appetite for money seemed insatiable, and Zara found herself taking greater risks to meet his demands. She began to manipulate the payroll, creating ghost employees and diverting their salaries. She falsified supplier invoices, pocketing the difference between the actual and inflated costs. The stress of maintaining the deception took its toll on Zara. She lost weight, dark circles forming under her eyes from sleepless nights spent agonizing over her actions. Her once bubbly personality became subdued, her passion for cooking diminishing, as the kitchen she once loved became a constant reminder of her betrayal. Lachlan, however, thrived. The influx of cash allowed him to pay off his gambling debts and even start making risky investments in the stock market. He began to dress better, drive a newer car, and talk about purchasing a house, all under the guise of planning for their future together. As the wedding date approached, Zara found herself trapped in a nightmare of her own making. The thought of marrying Lachlan filled her with dread, but she saw no way out. She had committed crimes, betrayed not only her fiancé but also Enzo and the restaurant that had given her a chance. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, making each day a struggle to maintain the facade of normality. Little did Zara know that her carefully constructed house of cards was about to come tumbling down. Enzo, sharp-eyed and attentive to his business, had begun to notice discrepancies in the books. The confrontation that was brewing would set in motion a chain of events that would change all their lives forever. Enzo Rossi had built his restaurant empire on attention to detail, and it was this meticulous nature that first alerted him to the problem. Small inconsistencies in the daily reports, slight discrepancies in the inventory. Individually, they were easy to overlook, but collectively, they painted a troubling picture. At first, Enzo attributed the errors to simple mistakes or software glitches. He spent long nights poring over spreadsheets, trying to reconcile the numbers. But as the discrepancies continued to mount, a sinking feeling settled in his stomach. Someone was stealing from him, and given the nature of the manipulations, it had to be someone with intimate knowledge of the restaurant's operations. His suspicions inevitably turned to Zara. She had access to all the systems, and the changes had begun around the time their affair started. The thought that she might be betraying him professionally as well as personally was almost too much to bear. Enzo chose a quiet afternoon to confront Zara, calling her into his office under the pretense of discussing a new menu. As soon as the door closed behind her, the facade dropped. He laid out the evidence he had gathered, watching her face carefully for any reaction. Zara's world seemed to crumble around her. Caught between her loyalty to Enzo and her fear of Lachlan, she broke down, confessing everything through a flood of tears. She told Enzo about Lachlan's discovery of their affair, the blackmail, and the escalating demands for money. Enzo listened in stunned silence, a maelstrom of emotions raging within him. Anger at the betrayal warred with concern for Zara, and fear for his own reputation. The revelation of the theft was bad enough, but if word of their affair got out, it would destroy not only his marriage, but also the carefully cultivated image he had built in the community. In the end, self-preservation won out. Enzo made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. He wouldn't go to the police. The risk of exposure was too great. Instead, he would handle this internally. He demanded that Zara end things with Lachlan immediately and return every cent that had been stolen. In return, he would keep quiet about her crimes. What Enzo didn't realize was that his decision to keep the police out of it would set in motion a dangerous chain of events. Lachlan, already teetering on the edge of desperation, would not take kindly to having his source of money cut off. And Zara, caught between two men and her own guilt, was a ticking time bomb of emotions. As Zara left Enzo's office, both of them believed they had found a solution. In reality, they had merely set the stage for a confrontation that would end in tragedy. In the days following her confrontation with Enzo, Zara felt as if she were walking on a tightrope, constantly on the verge of losing her balance. She knew she had to end things with Lachlan, but the thought filled her with dread. Lachlan had already shown how far he was willing to go to get what he wanted, and she feared his reaction to being cut off. Lachlan, oblivious to the shift in dynamics, continued to press Zara for more money. His demands had become increasingly erratic. Fueled by early success in his stock market gambles, he talked of quitting his job, of investing full-time, painting pictures of a lavish future that made Zara's stomach churn with anxiety. When Zara finally gathered the courage to confront Lachlan, the conversation quickly spiraled out of control. She told him about Enzo's discovery, her voice shaking as she explained that there would be no more money. Lachlan's reaction was explosive. He raged at her, accusing her of choosing Enzo over him, threatening to expose their affair and her theft to the entire town. In a moment of desperation, Zara blurted out that Enzo already knew about the affair, that he had chosen to keep it quiet to protect his own reputation. It was the wrong thing to say. Lachlan's anger transformed into a cold, calculating fury. If Enzo was willing to cover up the theft to hide the affair, Lachlan reasoned, then perhaps there was still a way to profit from the situation. Over the next few days, Lachlan began to formulate a new plan. He started showing up at the restaurant during busy hours, making vague comments within earshot of staff and customers. He sent anonymous letters to Vivian, hinting at her husband's infidelity without providing concrete details. Each move was designed to ratchet up the pressure on Enzo, to push him towards a breaking point. Zara watched this unfolding disaster with a sense of helpless dread. She tried to warn Enzo, but he was already retreating into himself, becoming paranoid and short-tempered. The once bustling kitchen of the restaurant became a pressure cooker of tension, with staff picking up on the strained atmosphere between Enzo and Zara. As Lachlan's actions became bolder, Enzo's grip on the situation began to slip. He started drinking heavily, making careless mistakes in the kitchen. Vivian, picking up on the whispers and her husband's strange behavior, became increasingly suspicious and confrontational. The carefully constructed lives of all involved were unraveling at an alarming rate. It was clear that something had to give, but no one could have predicted the violent culmination that was about to unfold in the very place where it all began, the kitchen of the restaurant. Tonight that changed everything started like any other at the restaurant. The dining room hummed with the chatter of patrons, the clink of cutlery against fine china, and the soft strains of Italian music. But in the kitchen, the atmosphere was charged with an almost palpable tension. Enzo had been drinking since the afternoon, his movements becoming increasingly erratic as he barked orders at his staff. Zara worked silently at her station, her eyes constantly darting to the door, dreading Lachlan's now nightly appearance to taunt them. It was just past 9 when Lachlan pushed through the kitchen doors, his face flushed with a dangerous combination of alcohol and bravado. "Enzo, you and I need to have a chat," he announced loudly, causing several of the kitchen staff to pause in their work. Enzo, his patience already worn thin, gestured sharply for Lachlan to follow him into the small office adjacent to the kitchen. Zara, her heart pounding, trailed after them, determined to prevent the confrontation she had been fearing. The next few minutes were a blur of shouting and accusations. Lachlan, emboldened by drink, laid out his demands, a substantial sum of money in exchange for his silence. Enzo, equally inebriated, refused, his face purpling with rage as he yelled at Lachlan to get out of his restaurant. Zara tried to intervene, pleading with both men to calm down, to think rationally. But her words fell on deaf ears. The situation escalated rapidly, with Lachlan grabbing a knife from a nearby prep table, and Enzo lunging for the gun he kept hidden in his desk drawer for emergencies. What happened next would be debated in the courts for months to come. In the chaos of the moment, with Zara screaming for them to stop, a shot rang out. The bullet, whether by intent or accident, struck Lachlan in the chest. He staggered backward, a look of shock on his face before crumpling to the floor. The kitchen erupted into pandemonium. Staff members rushed in, drawn by the sound of the gunshot. Someone called for an ambulance, while others tried to stem the flow of blood from Lachlan's wound. Enzo stood frozen, the gun still in his hand, as the full impact of what had just occurred washed over him. Zara, in a state of shock, found herself mechanically reciting the events to the police officers who arrived on the scene. She watched as Lachlan was stretchered out, his fate uncertain, and as Enzo was led away in handcuffs, still protesting that it had been self-defense. As the adrenaline of the moment faded, the weight of her role in the tragedy began to sink in. Her affair with Enzo, her agreement to Lachlan's blackmail scheme, her failure to come clean earlier, all of it had led to this moment. The life she had carefully built in Millhaven lay in ruins around her, and she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The shot fired in the kitchen of the restaurant that night echoed far beyond its walls, setting in motion a series of events that would captivate and horrify the small coastal town for years to come. In the days following the shooting, Millhaven found itself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight. News vans lined the streets, reporters eager for any morsel of information about the tragedy that had unfolded in the town's beloved Italian restaurant. The investigation moved quickly, with detectives piecing together the complex web of relationships and motivations that had led to that fateful night. Zara, racked with guilt and exhaustion, provided a full confession, detailing the affair, the blackmail, and the theft. Her cooperation proved crucial in unraveling the full extent of the situation. Lachlan, having survived the initial shooting, clung to life in the intensive care unit of Millhaven General Hospital. As he recovered, he too began to talk, his version of events largely corroborating Zara's account, though colored by his own perspective of victimhood. Enzo, initially held on attempted murder charges, maintained his claim of self-defense. The discovery of the knife near where Lachlan had fallen lent some credence to his story, but the circumstances surrounding the confrontation complicated matters. As the details of the case became public, the town reeled from the revelations. The image of the restaurant as a charming family restaurant was shattered, replaced by lurid tales of adultery and financial crimes. Vivian, devastated by her husband's infidelity and the public humiliation, filed for divorce and resigned from her position on the town council. The employees of the restaurant found themselves suddenly out of work as the restaurant was closed indefinitely, its future uncertain. Many in the town felt betrayed, their trust in people they had considered pillars of the community irreparably damaged. As the case moved towards trial, plea negotiations began behind the scenes. Prosecutors, aware of the complexities of the case and the potential for a lengthy, sensational trial, were open to deals that would avoid a public spectacle. Zara, advised by her lawyer and hoping to avoid a harsh sentence, agreed to testify against both Lachlan and Enzo in exchange for leniency. Lachlan, facing charges of extortion and conspiracy, sought a similar arrangement, eager to paint himself as a victim of circumstance rather than an instigator. Enzo, however, remained adamant about his innocence, insisting on his right to a trial. His defense team began to construct a narrative of a hard-working businessman driven to desperate measures by threats and blackmail. As the legal machinery ground forward, the residents of Millhaven were left to grapple with the aftermath of the tragedy. Trust had been broken, reputations shattered, and the very fabric of the community tested. The true cost of the events at the restaurant, it seemed, would be paid not just by those directly involved, but by the entire town. The jury, while sympathetic to the pressures he had faced, couldn't overlook the fact that he had escalated the confrontation by producing a gun. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5. Zara Callahan, in exchange for her testimony and full cooperation, received a suspended sentence and probation for her role in the embezzlement scheme. The judge, taking into account her remorse and the coercion she had faced, opted for leniency. However, her career in the culinary world was effectively over, her reputation irreparably tarnished. Lachlan Thorne, who survived the shooting but was left with permanent injuries, pleaded guilty to extortion and blackmail charges. He received a 5-year prison sentence, with the judge noting the calculated nature of his actions and the devastating consequences they had wrought. The restaurant never reopened its doors. The building stood empty for years, a stark reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. At the heart of this story are two couples. Isabella and Russell Hawthorne, both in their early 50s, had been fixtures of the community for over 2 decades. They were the couple everyone looked up to. Successful, well-respected, and seemingly happily married, their home was often the center of neighborhood gatherings. Just 3 houses down, the newly wedded Zara and Eric Donovan had recently moved in. Both in their mid-20s, they brought a youthful energy to the street that had long been dominated by older families and retirees. Their arrival was met with curiosity and warmth by their neighbors, particularly the Hawthornes. Little did anyone know that the lives of these 4 individuals would soon become entangled in a web of desire, obsession, and murder. What began as a daring experiment in sexual exploration would spiral into a nightmare that would leave one dead, one behind bars, and 2 others grappling with the consequences of their choices. This is the story of how a seemingly innocent proposition led to a brutal crime that would be splashed across national headlines and forever change the lives of those involved. It's a cautionary tale of the dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most ordinary-seeming individuals and the devastating consequences of stepping outside societal norms. Isabella Hawthorne had always been the golden girl. Growing up in Seattle, she was the captain of her high school cheerleading squad, prom queen and valedictorian. But Isabella was more than just a pretty face. She had a sharp mind and boundless ambition. She met Russell Hawthorne during her sophomore year at the University of Washington. Russell, 2 years her senior, was the star quarterback with a bright future ahead of him. Their courtship was the stuff of campus legend, the perfect couple that everyone envied. They married shortly after Isabella's graduation, with dreams of conquering the world together. Russell's promising football career was cut short by a knee injury in his first year as a professional player. He pivoted to sports management, quickly climbing the corporate ladder. Isabella, meanwhile, pursued a career in marketing, her creativity and drive making her a rising star in the field. Their move coincided with the birth of their daughter, Lily. They threw themselves into parenthood and their careers with equal fervor. From the outside, they seemed to have it all: successful careers, a beautiful home, and a loving family. But as the years went by, cracks began to appear in their perfect facade. Russell's work kept him away from home for longer stretches, and he began to put on weight, losing the athletic physique that had first attracted Isabella. For her part, Isabella found herself increasingly restless. With Lily away at college, the house felt empty, and her job no longer provided the satisfaction it once did. Isabella began to wonder if this was all there was to life. She started yoga classes and joined a book club, searching for something to fill the growing void she felt. She found herself envying the young couples she saw, with their passionate embraces and carefree laughter. When was the last time she and Russell had shared such moments? Russell, oblivious to his wife's discontent, continued his routine of long hours at the office, followed by evenings in front of the TV with a beer in hand. Their conversations became perfunctory, limited to discussions about bills, home maintenance, and occasional updates about Lily. As her 50th birthday approached, Isabella felt a growing sense of panic. Was this how she would spend the rest of her life? The woman who had once been voted most likely to succeed now felt trapped in a gilded cage of her own making. It was in this state of mind that Isabella first laid eyes on Eric Donovan. Young, handsome, with a lean swimmer's build, Eric represented everything that was missing from Isabella's life: excitement, passion, and the promise of adventure. For the first time in years, Isabella felt a stirring of desire. As she watched Eric and his young wife Zara move into the neighborhood, an idea began to form in her mind. An idea that would change everything. Zara Donovan, born Zara Khalil, was the daughter of Lebanese immigrants who had settled in Portland 2 decades earlier. Growing up, she had always felt caught between two worlds: the traditional values of her parents and the liberal, free-spirited culture of the Pacific Northwest. With her olive skin, Zara stood out in a city that was predominantly white. From a young age, Zara showed a passion for art. Her parents, while supportive, always emphasized the importance of a practical career. As a compromise, Zara studied graphic design at Portland State University, finding a way to merge her creative instincts with a marketable skill. It was during her final year at PSU that Zara met Eric Donovan. She was working on her thesis project at a local coffee shop when Eric, a barista there, struck up a conversation about her sketches. Eric, with his easy charm and boyish good looks, immediately captured Zara's attention. Eric had grown up in a small town in rural Oregon, the youngest of 4 boys in a working-class family. He'd moved to Portland 3 years earlier, drawn by the city's vibrant art scene and progressive culture. While he worked as a barista to pay the bills, his true passion was photography. His Instagram account, filled with moody black and white portraits in stark urban landscapes, had a modest but growing following. Their romance was a whirlwind. Within weeks of their first meeting, Eric and Zara were inseparable. They spent their days exploring Portland's hidden gems, secret gardens, underground art galleries, hole-in-the-wall music venues. Eric introduced Zara to urban exploration, and she in turn taught him about Lebanese cuisine and culture. To Zara, Eric represented freedom and self-expression. He encouraged her to pursue her art without compromise, to break free from the expectations of her family and society. With Eric, Zara felt seen and understood in a way she never had before. For Eric, Zara was his muse and his anchor. Her quiet strength and unwavering support gave him the confidence to pursue his photography more seriously. He began to book small gigs, weddings, local band promotional shots, even a few magazine spreads. Their decision to get married came as a surprise to many who knew them. Both sets of parents expressed concern about the speed of their relationship, but Eric and Zara were convinced they had found their soulmates. They had a small ceremony in a sculpture garden, surrounded by their closest friends and family.
The move was a practical decision. As freelancers, they needed a space that could serve as both home and studio. The quiet suburb offered affordable housing, close enough to the city for work opportunities. They saw it as the perfect place to start their life together.
Envisioning lazy Sunday mornings in their backyard and cozy evenings planning their future, little did they know that their new neighborhood held secrets and temptations that would test the strength of their young love. As they unpacked boxes in their new home, neither Eric nor Zara could have imagined the turmoil that lay ahead or the devastating consequences their choices would have. The annual summer block party was a tradition that dated back decades. Every year on the last Saturday of August, Sycamore Lane would transform into a bustling fairground of sorts. Neighbors would bring out grills, coolers full of drinks, and folding tables laden with potluck dishes. Children would run around with water guns and bubble wands, while adults caught up on neighborhood gossip and sipped cold beers. This year's party held a special significance for the residents of Sycamore Lane. It was the official welcome for the Donovans, the street's newest additions. Isabella Hawthorne, as the unofficial social director of the neighborhood, had taken it upon herself to ensure that Zara and Eric felt welcomed. As the afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the street, Isabella made her way to the Donovans, who were standing somewhat awkwardly at the edge of the gathering. "Isabella, you look lovely," Russell called out as she walked past, her sundress floating around her legs. She flashed him a smile, but her eyes were already fixed on Eric. "Eric and Zara, welcome to the neighborhood," Isabella said warmly, air-kissing Zara's cheeks and letting her hand linger perhaps a moment too long on Eric's arm. "We're so glad you could join us." The conversation flowed easily, lubricated by the fruity sangria Isabella had brought along. Zara found herself drawn into a discussion about local art galleries with some of the other neighbors, while Eric and Isabella drifted towards the Hawthorns' front yard. "You have a beautiful home," Eric commented, his eyes roving over the house. Isabella beamed with pride. "Why, thank you," she replied. "You should see the inside. We recently renovated the master bathroom. Perhaps I could give you a tour sometime. Get you some ideas for your own place?" The flirtatious undertone in Isabella's voice was unmistakable. Eric, slightly taken aback but not displeased, felt a flush creep up his neck. Before he could respond, Russell appeared, clapping a hand on Eric's shoulder. "Hope my wife isn't talking your ear off, son." Russell chuckled. Isabella shot him a look that mixed annoyance and affection. "Actually, she was just offering to show me your renovation," Eric said, his voice slightly strained. As the evening wore on, the two couples found themselves gravitating towards each other. Zara, charmed by Russell's dad jokes and genuine interest in her artwork, found herself relaxing for the first time since moving in. Isabella, meanwhile, hung on Eric's every word as he described his photography projects. By the time the party wound down, seeds had been planted. Seeds of attraction, curiosity, and temptation that would soon grow into something none of them could have anticipated. It was a week after the block party that Isabella first broached the subject with Russell. They were in bed, the TV droning in the background, when Isabella turned to her husband with a mischievous glint in her eye. Isabella broached the subject with Russell one night as they lay in bed. Her voice was casual, but there was an undercurrent of excitement as she asked if he had ever considered spicing up their love life. Russell, half asleep, mumbled incoherently at first. Isabella pressed on, clarifying that she meant specifically in the bedroom. This caught Russell's attention and he became suddenly alert. Cautiously, Russell asked what exactly she had in mind. Isabella took a deep breath before suggesting they try swapping partners with another couple. The silence that followed her proposal was deafening. Russell stared at his wife, trying to determine if she was serious. As he realized she was, a mix of emotions played across his face: shock, intrigue, and a hint of arousal. Over the next few days, the Hawthorns had numerous discussions about Isabella's proposition. Russell, initially hesitant, found himself warming to the idea. The thought of being with a younger woman stirred something in him he thought had long since died. It was Isabella who finally suggested the Donovans. They're young, attractive, and new to the area, she reasoned. They might be open to something like this. Approaching the younger couple proved to be a delicate matter. It was at a neighborhood barbecue that Isabella, emboldened by several glasses of wine, pulled Zara aside. The conversation was awkward at first, with Isabella dancing around the subject, but once the proposition was laid out, Zara's reaction surprised her. Instead of outrage or disgust, There was curiosity in the younger woman's eyes. The evening of the swap arrived with a mix of nervous energy and anticipation. The Hawthorns had suggested using their home, citing their finished basement as a perfect, private setting. As Zara and Eric walked up the driveway hand in hand, Zara could feel her heart pounding in her chest. "Are we really doing this?" He squeezed her hand reassuringly, but she could see the apprehension in his eyes as well. Isabella greeted them at the door, her smile a little too bright, her laugh a little too loud. The forced casualness of the situation was palpable as they made small talk over glasses of expensive red wine. Russell busied himself with the stereo, filling the room with soft jazz in an attempt to ease the tension. After what seemed like an eternity of awkward conversation, Isabella finally stood up. "So," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "shall we?" They had agreed beforehand on the pairings, Isabella with Eric, Russell with Zara. As they split off, Zara couldn't help but glance back at Eric, a moment of uncertainty passing between them. But then Eric disappeared down the hallway with Isabella, and Zara found herself alone with Russell. Russell led Zara to the guest bedroom, his hand gentle on the small of her back. Despite his earlier bravado, he felt a wave of nervousness wash over him. It had been years since he'd been with anyone other than Isabella. Zara, sensing his hesitation, took the initiative. She reached up and kissed him softly, then more passionately. Russell responded, his hands exploring her young, firm body with growing confidence. Meanwhile, in the master bedroom, Isabella was living out the fantasies she'd been harboring since she first laid eyes on Eric. His youthful energy and enthusiasm more than made up for any lack of experience. Isabella felt desired, beautiful, alive in a way she hadn't in years. Eric, for his part, was intoxicated by Isabella's confidence and sensuality. As the encounters reached their climax, a series of emotions washed over each participant. Excitement, pleasure, guilt, and an unexpected emptiness all mingled together in a confusing cocktail. Afterwards, as they all reconvened in the living room, an awkward silence fell over the group. The reality of what they had done seemed to hit them all at once. Zara couldn't meet Eric's eyes, focusing instead on smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her dress. Russell cleared his throat several times, but couldn't seem to find any words. Only Isabella seemed truly at ease, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. It was Eric who finally broke the silence. "Well," he said, his attempt at a casual tone falling flat. That was something. The tension broke and nervous laughter filled the room. They made stilted small talk for a few more minutes before the Donovans made their excuses and left. As Zara and Eric walked home in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, they were unaware of the seismic shift that had just occurred in their relationships. Back in the Hawthorne house, Isabella hummed to herself as she cleaned up, already thinking about the next time. Russell watched her, a nagging feeling of unease growing in the pit of his stomach. None of them realized that this night was just the beginning, the first step down a path that would lead to obsession, betrayal, and ultimately, tragedy. In the days following the swap, life seemed to return to normal, but beneath the surface, changes were brewing, particularly in Eric Donovan. Eric found himself unable to stop thinking about Isabella. The encounter had awakened something in him, a hunger he'd never experienced before. He began to find excuses to be outside when he knew Isabella would be leaving for work. He'd wave, trying to appear casual, but his eyes would linger on her long after she'd driven away. Zara noticed the change in her husband almost immediately. Eric seemed distracted, often lost in thought. When she tried to initiate intimacy, he was either too tired or not in the mood. Their once passionate lovemaking became infrequent and mechanical. One afternoon, Zara came home early from a client meeting to find Eric's photography workspace in disarray. As she began to tidy up, she noticed something odd. Hidden beneath a stack of prints was a folder filled with photos of Isabella. Some were clearly taken from a distance, capturing Isabella gardening, getting her mail, or walking to her car. Others were more intimate, zoomed-in shots through windows, Isabella in various states of undress. Zara felt her stomach churn. This wasn't just a harmless crush or the after effects of their encounter. This was something much more sinister. Meanwhile, Isabella had begun to notice Eric's increased presence in her daily life. At first, she was flattered by the attention, even reciprocating with flirtatious glances and accidental touches when they'd run into each other. But as the days wore on, Eric's behavior became more erratic and intense. He began sending her messages at all hours,
alternating between passionate declarations of love and angry accusations. When she didn't respond quickly enough, Isabella tried to let him down gently, explaining that their encounter was a one-time thing, but Eric refused to accept it. One night, Isabella woke to the sound of something hitting her bedroom window. Peering out, she saw Eric standing in her front yard, a handful of pebbles in his hand. His eyes, wild and unfocused, locked onto hers. "I can't live without you, Isabella," he called out, his voice breaking. "We're meant to be together." Isabella quickly closed the curtains, her heart racing. She woke Russell, who grumbled as he went to confront Eric. By the time Russell made it outside, Eric had disappeared into the night, leaving only a crumpled bouquet of flowers on the front step. As Isabella lay awake that night, she realized with growing horror that her exciting sexual experiment had unleashed something dark and dangerous. She had no idea how right she was, or how tragic the consequences would be. Over the next few weeks, Eric's behavior spiraled further out of control. His obsession with Isabella consumed every aspect of his life. He neglected his photography business, spending hours stalking Isabella's social media accounts and driving by her house. Zara watched helplessly as her husband transformed into someone she barely recognized. Isabella, for her part, vacillated between fear and a perverse excitement. Part of her was terrified of Eric's growing instability, but another part, a part she was ashamed to admit existed, was thrilled by his obsessive attention. It made her feel desirable, powerful in a way she hadn't in years. The situation came to a head one afternoon, when Isabella returned home to find Eric sitting in her living room. "How did you get in here?" she gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Eric smiled, a cold, unsettling expression that sent chills down Isabella's spine. "You gave me a key, remember? For watering the plants when you were on vacation." Isabella's mind raced. That had been months ago, before the swap, before everything had gone wrong. She should have asked for it back. Why hadn't she asked for it back? Eric stood, moving towards her with predatory grace. "We need to talk, Isabella," he said, his voice low and intense. "About us, about our future together." Isabella backed away, fumbling for her phone. "There is no us, Eric," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You need to leave." But Eric kept advancing, his eyes wild with a mixture of love and madness. "You don't mean that," he insisted. "I know you feel what I feel. We're destined to be together, Isabella. I won't let anyone come between us." As Eric reached for her, Isabella let out a scream. The sound seemed to snap Eric out of his trance. He blinked, looking around as if seeing the room for the first time. Without another word, he brushed past Isabella and out the front door. Shaking, Isabella collapsed onto the couch. She knew she should call the police, but what would she say? That she'd willingly slept with her young neighbor, and now he was stalking her. The thought of the scandal, of everyone knowing what she'd done, was unbearable. Little did Isabella know, her silence would have devastating consequences. For in his twisted mind, Eric took her failure to report him as a sign of her secret love, and he was determined to eliminate any obstacles standing in their way, no matter the cost. The tension that had been building for weeks finally erupted on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Isabella was alone in her house, Russell having left for a golf game with friends. She was in the kitchen, mindlessly flipping through a magazine when she heard the back door open. Isabella called out with a trembling voice, asking if it was Eric. There was no response, only the sound of footsteps moving through the house. Her heart racing, Isabella grabbed a kitchen knife, holding it out in front of her like a shield. When Eric appeared in the doorway, his eyes were glazed and unfocused, and he reeked of alcohol. He slurred that he had seen Russell drive away, declaring that now they could be together as they were supposed to be. Isabella pleaded with Eric, telling him he needed help and that this wasn't right, but she couldn't finish her sentence. Eric wasn't listening. He lunged forward, trying to grab Isabella. She shrieked and swung the knife wildly, connecting with Eric's arm and drawing blood. The sight of his own blood seemed to enrage Eric further. He roared an insult at her and charged again. In the ensuing struggle, the knife clattered to the floor. Eric's hands found Isabella's throat, squeezing with terrifying strength. Isabella clawed at his face, gasping for air as her vision began to darken around the edges. In desperation, she brought her knee up sharply, connecting with Eric's groin. The blow caused him to double over in pain, releasing his grip on her throat. Isabella scrambled away, her fingers closing around the handle of the fallen knife. As Eric straightened up, his face contorted with rage, Isabella acted on pure instinct. She thrust the knife forward, feeling it sink into Eric's chest.
For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Eric looked down at the knife protruding from his body, a look of surprise replacing the anger on his face. Then slowly he crumpled to the floor. Isabella stared at Eric's still form, the reality of what she'd done crashing over her. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone and dialed 911. The quiet of the community was shattered by the wail of sirens as police cars and an ambulance converged on the Hawthorne residence. Neighbors poured out onto their front lawns, watching in shock as paramedics rushed into the house, only to emerge shortly after, shaking their heads grimly. Detective Liam Reeves, a veteran of the Portland Police Department, arrived on the scene to find a distraught Isabella Hawthorne being questioned by officers. Her hands and clothes were stained with blood, her eyes wild with shock and fear. As Reeves approached, he overheard snippets of Isabella's statement. She was saying that Eric had attacked her, that she had no choice, and expressing shock and disbelief at what she had done. Reeves took charge of the scene, ordering a thorough search of the house and surrounding area, while crime scene technicians combed through the kitchen. Photographing the bloody knife and the signs of struggle, Reeves turned his attention to the neighbors. Zara Donovan stood at the edge of the police tape, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. Reeves approached her gently, introducing himself as Detective Reeves and confirming that the victim was her husband. Zara nodded mutely, tears streaming down her face. When Reeves pressed her about when she had last seen Eric, Zara managed to choke out that it had been that morning. She explained that Eric had said he was going for a walk, but her voice trailed off as she struggled to process the situation. Unable to continue, she broke down sobbing. Reeves made a note in his pad before moving on to question other neighbors. As he gathered more information, a story began to emerge of a quiet neighborhood rocked by an unthinkable crime. As the body of Eric Donovan was wheeled out on a gurney, covered by a sheet, Reeves couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this case than a simple home invasion gone wrong. The look in Isabella Hawthorne's eyes, a mixture of relief and guilt, told him that unraveling the truth would be a complex and delicate process. In the days following Eric's death, Detective Reeves dove deep into the lives of both the Hawthornes and the Donovans. What he uncovered was a tangled web of secrets and lies that painted a very different picture from the initial reports of a random break-in. Interviews with neighbors revealed whispers of an illicit affair between Isabella and Eric. Cell phone records showed an overwhelming number of calls and messages from Eric to Isabella in the weeks leading up to the incident, many of which had gone unanswered. But it was the discovery of Eric's photography studio that blew the case wide open. Hidden among his professional equipment, detectives found a camera with a high-powered zoom lens and memory cards filled with hundreds of photos of Isabella, many taken without her knowledge. When confronted with this evidence, Zara broke down. Through tears, she revealed the truth about the partner swap and the subsequent obsession that had gripped her husband. She spoke of Eric's erratic behavior, his neglect of their marriage, and her own fears about his mental state. Isabella, faced with the mounting evidence, finally confessed to the full story. She admitted to the affair and the stalking, but maintained that the final confrontation had been self-defense. Russell, devastated by his wife's infidelity, nonetheless stood by her side throughout the ordeal. As Reeves pieced together the events that led to that fatal Sunday afternoon, he was struck by the tragedy of it all. What had begun as a misguided attempt to spice up a stagnant marriage had spiraled into an obsession that cost a young man his life and forever changed the lives of all involved. The case, once thought to be a straightforward home invasion, was now revealed to be a complex tale of desire, betrayal, and deadly obsession. The prosecution painted Isabella as a bored housewife who initiated an affair with a younger man, then killed him to keep her indiscretion secret. They emphasized the premeditated nature of her actions, pointing to the convenient absence of her husband on the day of the killing. The defense, led by high-profile attorney Simone Jeffries, argued passionately that Isabella was a victim of stalking and harassment who acted in self-defense. They presented evidence of Eric's obsessive behavior and called expert witnesses to testify about the psychological impact of stalking on victims. Zara's testimony proved to be a turning point in the trial. Her emotional account of Eric's descent into obsession and her own fear for Isabella's safety swayed many jurors. "She's not the monster they're making her out to be," Zara said through tears. "Eric, he wasn't himself at the end. What happened is a tragedy, but Isabella was as much a victim as anyone." In his closing arguments, The prosecutor urged the jury not to be swayed by emotion. "The facts are clear," he insisted. "Mrs. Hawthorne made a series of choices that led to this tragic outcome. She must be held accountable." Simone Jeffries, in her rebuttal, appealed to the jury's sense of empathy. "Put yourself in Isabella's shoes," she implored. Terrified, alone, confronted by a man who had been stalking her for weeks, she did what anyone would do. She fought for her life. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, the courtroom buzzed with speculation. The fate of Isabella Hawthorne and the final judgment on this suburban tragedy now rested in their hands. Isabella Hawthorne was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3. As Isabella was led away from the courtroom, the impact of the tragedy on all involved was palpable. Russell Hawthorne, his face haggard from the stress of the trial, watched his wife disappear through the courtroom doors. Despite the revelations of her infidelity, he had stood by her throughout the ordeal. Now he faced the prospect of years alone, grappling with the consequences of their ill-fated experiment. Zara Donovan, widowed and alone, retreated from public life. The trauma of losing Eric and the public exposure of their private lives left deep scars. She threw herself into her art, producing a series of haunting paintings that would later be hailed as a powerful exploration of grief and betrayal. The residents struggled to come to terms with the events that had shattered their peaceful community. The Hawthorne and Donovan houses stood empty, constant reminders of the tragedy that had unfolded. Some neighbors moved away, unable to bear the memories. Those who stayed found their trust in one another irrevocably altered. In the quiet, picturesque town of Pine Hill, the gruesome murder of Jennifer Johnson sent shockwaves through the community. What appeared to be a peaceful, close-knit suburban enclave was shattered by a crime of passion and betrayal that revealed the dark underbelly of seemingly idyllic lives. The lives of two couples, Daniel and Linda Garner, and Mark and Jennifer Johnson, intertwined in ways that would lead to obsession, deceit, and ultimately, murder. Daniel Garner was a respected architect, known for his charming demeanor and seemingly perfect marriage to Linda, a dedicated school teacher. Mark Johnson, a successful financial advisor, and his wife Jennifer were the Garners' closest friends. The two couples shared more than just neighborhood barbecues and weekend getaways. They also engaged in a consensual wife-swapping arrangement that initially brought excitement and novelty to their lives. However, beneath the surface of this unconventional lifestyle, dangerous emotions were brewing. Daniel's fascination with Jennifer grew into an all-consuming obsession, one that Linda, his wife, was painfully aware of. Jennifer, sensing the intensity of Daniel's feelings, decided to put an end to the arrangement, not realizing the deadly consequences her decision would provoke. Daniel and Linda Garner had been married for 10 years, and from the outside, their marriage appeared to be a model of stability and happiness. Daniel was a successful architect, known for his innovative designs and charismatic personality. Linda, a third-grade teacher, was beloved by her students and respected by her colleagues. They lived in a charming house on Maple Street, surrounded by a well-tended garden that Linda took great pride in. Mark and Jennifer Johnson moved to Pine Hill 5 years ago and quickly became friends with the Garners. Mark, a financial advisor, was outgoing and affable, always the life of the party. Jennifer, with her striking beauty and magnetic personality, was equally popular. The Johnsons' arrival brought a new dynamic to the neighborhood, and their friendship with the Garners blossomed over shared interests and mutual respect. The idea of wife-swapping was first brought up during a dinner party at the Garners' home. Fueled by wine and a sense of adventure, the conversation turned to the topic of open relationships. To everyone's surprise, the concept was met with curiosity rather than shock. Over the next few weeks, the idea was discussed more seriously, with all parties agreeing to boundaries and rules to ensure their primary relationships remained intact. The first encounter was awkward but exciting. Daniel and Jennifer, and Mark and Linda exchanged partners for the night. It was a thrilling yet nerve-wracking experience, but one that left them eager for more. What started as a once-in-a-while experiment soon became a regular part of their lives, adding a spark to both marriages. Initially, the arrangement seemed to work well. Both couples appeared happier and more connected. They maintained their social activities,
often hosting joint parties and going on vacations together. Their secret was carefully guarded, discussed only within the confines of their homes or during private gatherings. The novelty of the arrangement brought a sense of exhilaration, and for a while, it seemed like they had found the perfect balance. However, as the months passed, subtle changes began to surface, particularly in Daniel's behavior. He started to show an unusual amount of interest in Jennifer, often finding reasons to spend time alone with her. Linda noticed his increasing preoccupation, but chose to ignore it, hoping it was just a phase. Mark, too, seemed oblivious to the growing tension. Unbeknownst to the others, Daniel's fascination with Jennifer was turning into something deeper and more troubling. He found himself thinking about her constantly, replaying their encounters in his mind and craving more time with her. What had started as a harmless adventure was slowly morphing into an obsession that would have devastating consequences for all involved. Daniel's fascination with Jennifer was no longer just a thrill. It had evolved into an all-consuming obsession. He thought about her incessantly, his mind wandering to their encounters during work meetings and family dinners. His architectural projects, once his passion, now seemed secondary to his desire for Jennifer. He started to find ways to be near her, volunteering to help with tasks Mark usually handled, or inviting the Johnsons over more frequently. Linda began to notice the change in her husband. At first, she attributed it to the excitement of their new lifestyle, but soon it became clear that Daniel's interest in Jennifer went beyond their agreement. He became irritable and distant when they weren't with the Johnsons, and his conversations often veered towards Jennifer's likes and dislikes, her quirks and habits. One evening, while cleaning up after a dinner party, Linda confronted Daniel. His reaction was defensive, dismissing her concerns as jealousy. Linda, not wanting to disrupt the delicate balance they had established, let it go but kept a closer eye on him. Her suspicions grew when she found him staring at Jennifer during gatherings, his gaze lingering longer than necessary. Jennifer, too, began to sense Daniel's growing obsession. Initially flattered by his attention, she soon found it uncomfortable. His touches became more possessive, his words more intimate than appropriate. She discussed her discomfort with Mark, who brushed it off, believing Daniel was just more expressive in his affections. Mark's nonchalance left Jennifer feeling isolated in her concerns. The turning point came during a weekend trip to a lakeside cabin. The couples had planned the getaway to reconnect and enjoy some time away from their routine. However, the trip only served to highlight Daniel's fixation. He monopolized Jennifer's time, insisting on taking her out on the lake alone, leaving Mark and Linda behind. The tension was palpable, and Jennifer's attempts to distance herself were met with subtle resistance from Daniel. One night, while sitting by the fire, Daniel made a comment that crossed the line. He spoke about leaving everything behind and starting fresh, just the two of them. Jennifer, shocked and unsettled, excused herself and went to bed early. Linda, who had overheard the conversation, confronted Daniel again. This time he was less dismissive, but still refused to acknowledge the depth of his feelings. Linda's frustration grew as she realized the extent of Daniel's obsession. She loved her husband, but was increasingly aware that his infatuation with Jennifer could destroy their marriage and their friendship with the Johnsons. Despite her efforts to intervene, Daniel's behavior only became more erratic. He started to follow Jennifer outside of their arranged meetings, showing up at her yoga classes, and even appearing at her workplace under the guise of casual visits. Jennifer's unease turned to fear. She confided in a close friend, who advised her to distance herself from Daniel as much as possible. Determined to take control, Jennifer decided to end the arrangement altogether. She hoped that by doing so, Daniel would return to his senses, and they could all move on from this chapter without causing further harm. One evening, while Mark was away on a business trip, Daniel showed up at the Johnsons' house unannounced. Jennifer was taken aback but let him in, hoping to avoid a scene. They sat in the living room, the air thick with unspoken tension. Daniel confessed his feelings for her, speaking of a future where they could be together openly. Jennifer, horrified, tried to reason with him, explaining that their arrangement was never meant to be more than a temporary excitement. As Daniel's declarations became more intense, Jennifer's fear turned to anger. She realized she needed to put an end to this before it destroyed her marriage and her friendship with Linda. She told Daniel firmly that their arrangement was over and that he needed to respect her boundaries and her marriage. Daniel, visibly shaken,
tried to persuade her to reconsider, but Jennifer stood her ground. Over the next few days, Jennifer avoided Daniel, hoping he would come to his senses. She confided in Linda, who listened with a heavy heart. Linda knew her husband's obsession had gone too far, and while she wanted to support Jennifer, she also felt a twisted loyalty to Daniel. She promised Jennifer she would talk to him, hoping to defuse the situation. However, Daniel's obsession only deepened. He started showing up at Jennifer's work, waiting for her after hours, and leaving her messages expressing his undying love. Jennifer, feeling increasingly unsafe, decided to confront him one last time, hoping to make him understand the gravity of his actions. They met at a secluded park away from prying eyes. Jennifer reiterated that their arrangement was over and that his behavior was unacceptable. She pleaded with him to let go and move on. Daniel, unable to accept her rejection, grew desperate. He accused her of leading him on and playing with his emotions. Jennifer, maintaining her composure, insisted that they part ways and return to their respective marriages. Unbeknownst to them, Linda had followed Daniel to the park. She watched from a distance, her heart pounding as she saw the confrontation unfold. She could see the anguish on Daniel's face and the determination on Jennifer's. Linda knew that this confrontation was inevitable, but she also feared what might happen next. As the argument escalated, Daniel's desperation turned to anger. Jennifer's refusal to entertain his fantasies felt like a personal betrayal. He lashed out verbally, calling her names and accusing her of ruining his life. Jennifer, holding back tears, stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. Linda, watching from the shadows, felt a surge of panic. She knew she had to intervene before things got out of hand. She stepped out of her hiding place and approached the two, her voice shaking as she called out to Daniel. The sight of Linda seemed to snap Daniel out of his rage, and he turned to her, his expression a mix of confusion and relief. Jennifer, taking advantage of the distraction, walked away, determined to put as much distance between herself and Daniel as possible. Linda, now alone with her husband, tried to calm him down. She reassured him that they would find a way to move past this, but inside she knew that their lives had been irreversibly changed. The affair had reached its breaking point, and Jennifer's decision to end the arrangement had set off a chain of events that could not be undone. As the dust settled, the true extent of Daniel's obsession and the depths of Linda's complicity would soon come to light, leading to a tragic and violent conclusion. The confrontation at the park had left Daniel in a state of turmoil. Jennifer's firm rejection and Linda's unexpected appearance had shaken him to his core. He returned home that night, his mind a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and despair. Linda, sensing the storm brewing within him, tried to soothe his troubled thoughts, but Daniel remained inconsolable. Over the next few days, Daniel's behavior became increasingly erratic. He vacillated between bouts of intense anger and deep despondency. He stopped going to work, spending his days obsessing over Jennifer's rejection and the perceived injustices he had suffered. Linda, unable to reach him, felt her own frustration and fear growing. She knew something had to give, but she wasn't prepared for the drastic turn of events that would soon unfold. Jennifer, on the other hand, was determined to move forward. She avoided all contact with Daniel, focusing on her work and her relationship with Mark. She hadn't told her husband the full extent of Daniel's obsession, fearing his reaction and the potential fallout. She hoped that by cutting ties, Daniel would eventually come to terms with the end of their arrangement and leave her alone. One evening, Jennifer returned home from work to find Daniel waiting for her outside her house. Her heart sank at the sight of him, and she steeled herself for another confrontation. She approached him cautiously, her voice steady but firm as she told him to leave. Daniel, his eyes wild with desperation, begged her for one last chance to explain himself. Jennifer, sensing the futility of the conversation, tried to walk past him, but Daniel grabbed her arm. His grip was tight and painful, and Jennifer could see the madness in his eyes. She struggled to break free, her voice rising as she demanded he let go. The noise attracted the attention of a neighbor, who stepped outside to see what was happening. Seeing the neighbor, Daniel released Jennifer and fled. Jennifer, shaken and frightened, thanked the neighbor and hurried inside. She called Linda, hoping to find some way to resolve the situation without involving the police. Linda, hearing the fear in Jennifer's voice, agreed to meet with her the next day to discuss how to handle Daniel's increasingly unstable behavior. The next day, Linda met Jennifer at a local cafe. Jennifer, looking exhausted and tense, explained the encounter with Daniel and her growing fear for her safety. Linda listened intently, her mind racing as she tried to formulate a plan. She promised Jennifer that she would talk to Daniel and make him understand that their relationship was over. After the meeting, Linda returned home to find Daniel in a state of agitation. She confronted him about the incident with Jennifer, her voice a mix of anger and concern. Daniel, feeling cornered, lashed out at her, accusing her of taking Jennifer's side and betraying him. The argument escalated, and Linda, fearing for her own safety, retreated to their bedroom. That night, Daniel's thoughts turned darker. He couldn't accept that Jennifer had rejected him and that his own wife was against him. In his twisted mind, he believed that the only way to resolve the situation was to eliminate the source of his pain. He decided that if he couldn't have Jennifer, no one could. On a cold, clear night, Daniel made his way to the Johnsons' house. He knew Mark was out of town, leaving Jennifer alone. He broke in through a side window and made his way to the bedroom where Jennifer lay sleeping. The sight of her, peaceful and unaware, fueled his rage and desperation. He grabbed a kitchen knife and approached her, his mind filled with a chaotic mix of love and hatred. Jennifer awoke to the sight of Daniel standing over her, the knife gleaming in the dim light. She tried to scream, but Daniel covered her mouth, his grip strong and unyielding. In a fit of rage, he plunged the knife into her chest, silencing her cries. As Jennifer's life slipped away, Daniel stood over her, his mind a haze of conflicting emotions. In the aftermath of the murder, Daniel fled the scene, his hands stained with Jennifer's blood. He returned home, where Linda found him trembling and incoherent. She realized immediately what he had done, and in a moment of twisted loyalty, she decided to help him cover up the crime. The life they had built, the secrets they had kept, were all at stake. Linda knew that if they were to survive, they needed to act quickly and decisively. Linda, driven by a twisted sense of loyalty and self-preservation, quickly took control of the situation. She led Daniel to the bathroom, instructing him to remove his clothes and wash off the blood. Her mind raced with the urgency of their predicament. She knew they had to act fast to cover up the crime and protect their secret life. As Daniel stood under the hot shower, the water turning pink around his feet, Linda gathered his clothes and placed them in a plastic bag. She scrubbed the floor where he had walked, making sure to eliminate any trace of blood. Once Daniel was cleaned up, she sat him down and forced him to recount every detail of what had happened. Despite his emotional state, Daniel managed to provide a coherent account, his voice shaking with the weight of his actions. Linda devised a plan. They needed to create an alibi and dispose of any evidence linking them to the crime. She called a trusted friend, claiming that Daniel had been with her all evening, ensuring their alibi was backed up. Then, she drove to a secluded area outside of town, where she burned Daniel's blood-stained clothes and the murder weapon, praying that the fire would consume any remaining evidence. The police questioned everyone in the neighborhood, including the Garners. Linda's carefully crafted alibi held up under scrutiny, and Daniel, although visibly distressed, managed to avoid raising suspicion. The investigation seemed to stall, with no concrete leads pointing to the Garners. Despite their initial success in evading the authorities, the psychological toll of the murder weighed heavily on both Daniel and Linda. Daniel became increasingly paranoid, convinced that the police were closing in on him. He withdrew from friends and colleagues, isolating himself in a web of fear and regret. Linda, while outwardly composed, felt the strain of their secret pressing down on her. She became hyper-vigilant, scrutinizing every interaction and behavior for signs of suspicion from those around them. The weeks following Jennifer's murder were a blur of tension and deception for the Garners. Linda took on the role of the stabilizer, managing Daniel's paranoia while ensuring their public facade remained intact. She monitored the news for any updates on the investigation, relieved that the police seemed to have no solid leads. However, Linda knew that maintaining their cover required more than just an alibi. They needed to create a narrative that would divert attention away from Daniel. She suggested to Daniel that he should appear more distraught over Jennifer's death, to align with the community's grief and to throw off any suspicion. At social gatherings and community meetings, Daniel played the part of the grieving friend. He spoke of Jennifer with a mix of fondness and sorrow, his eyes often welling up with tears. Mark, devastated and desperate for answers, seemed to appreciate Daniel's empathy, never suspecting his friend's involvement in his wife's death.
Daniel's mental state deteriorated further, his guilt manifesting in nightmares and hallucinations. He started drinking heavily, seeking solace in alcohol but finding only temporary escape. Linda, fearing he might confess in a drunken stupor, kept a close eye on him, often staying up late to ensure he didn't leave the house. One evening, as Daniel sat slumped over a glass of whiskey, he broke down. He confessed to Linda that he couldn't live with the guilt any longer, that he needed to come clean. Linda, panicked, tried to calm him down. To help maintain their composure, Linda suggested they take a short trip out of town. They traveled to a secluded cabin in the mountains, hoping the change of scenery would help Daniel regain some semblance of peace. The isolation provided a temporary respite, allowing them to plan their next steps without the constant pressure of the investigation looming over them. During their time at the cabin, Linda reinforced the importance of their secrecy. She coached Daniel on how to handle police questioning and public interactions, drilling him until he could respond without hesitation. Linda's determination to protect their lifestyle and avoid imprisonment fueled her relentless drive to keep their story straight. Upon returning to Pine Hill, the Garners resumed their lives with a renewed sense of purpose. Daniel, though still haunted by his actions, managed to present a more stable front. Linda continued to manage their interactions with the community, ensuring they remained above suspicion. However, the cracks in their facade were beginning to show. Friends and neighbors noticed Daniel's increased drinking and erratic behavior, and whispers of his possible involvement in Jennifer's death began to circulate. Linda, ever vigilant, worked to quash the rumors, but she knew their time was running out. As the police investigation continued, new evidence came to light, pointing towards inconsistencies in Daniel's alibi. The Garners' carefully constructed world was on the brink of collapse, and the truth was closer to being revealed than ever before. Detective Mitchell interviewed the Garners separately, noting any discrepancies in their stories. Linda's carefully crafted alibi held up under scrutiny, and Daniel's emotional state seemed consistent with that of a grieving friend. However, Mitchell's instincts told her there was more to the story. As the weeks passed, new evidence emerged. Forensic analysis of Jennifer's phone records revealed a series of increasingly desperate text messages from Daniel, indicating his obsession with her. Mitchell brought Daniel in for further questioning, pressing him on the inconsistencies in his alibi and the nature of his relationship with Jennifer. Daniel, struggling to maintain his composure, stuck to the story Linda had coached him on, but his nervousness and evasive answers only heightened the detective's suspicions. The turning point came when a neighbor came forward with crucial information. They had seen Daniel's car parked near the Johnsons' house on the night of the murder and remembered the strange behavior he had exhibited. This testimony, combined with the forensic evidence and Daniel's erratic behavior, was enough for the police to obtain a search warrant for the Garners' home. During the search, the police found remnants of the burned clothing and traces of blood that had seeped into the floorboards, despite Linda's thorough cleaning. This damning evidence, coupled with the witness testimony and phone records, painted a clear picture of Daniel's guilt. The net was closing in on the Garners, and Linda realized that their carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. She knew that their only chance of escaping a lengthy prison sentence was to come up with a new plan, one that would shift the blame away from them and onto someone else. As the police closed in, Linda and Daniel faced the harsh reality of their situation. The lies and deceit that had once protected them were now threatening to unravel completely, and the truth was about to be revealed in a way they could never have anticipated. As the evidence against Daniel mounted, Detective Mitchell prepared to make her move. She brought Daniel in for another round of questioning, this time with a different approach. She laid out all the evidence they had gathered, the phone records, the witness testimonies, and the forensic findings. Daniel, cornered and overwhelmed, began to crack under the pressure. Mitchell pressed harder, suggesting that if Daniel came clean, he might receive a more lenient sentence. Daniel, unable to handle the weight of his guilt and the relentless questioning, finally broke down. He confessed to killing Jennifer, describing his obsession, the confrontation, and the moment he lost control. However, in his confession, Daniel also implicated Linda, revealing her role in covering up the crime. He described how she had helped him clean up, dispose of evidence, and craft an alibi. Mitchell, sensing the opportunity to get the full story, had Linda brought in for questioning as well. Confronted with Daniel's confession, Linda initially denied any involvement,
But as Mitchell detailed the evidence in Daniel's account, Linda realized there was no way out. Her carefully constructed lies had finally unraveled. She admitted to helping Daniel, explaining that she had done it out of a misguided sense of loyalty and fear of losing everything they had built. The trial of Daniel and Linda Garner captivated Pine Hill and the surrounding region. The courtroom was packed with reporters and curious onlookers, eager to see the conclusion of the tragic tale. Daniel, charged with first-degree murder, and Linda, charged with accessory to murder and obstruction of justice, both pled guilty to their respective charges. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Linda, despite her role in the cover-up, received a lighter sentence due to her cooperation with the investigation and her previously clean record. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. Mark Johnson, left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life, found some solace in the justice served, but continued to mourn the loss of his beloved wife.